Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunted Bedtime. I know many of you tune into these stories to help you drift off to sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. In 1953, my mother moved to Phoenix, Arizona from Colorado with my sister, my brother, and me into a duplex located in a poor neighborhood on the edge of an industrial area. I was 7 years old at the time. Our duplex was the third house away from the main neighborhood, separated by a dairy, some small businesses, railroads, a brewery, and a slaughterhouse called Cudahy Meats. We moved into the right side of the duplex, which had only 3 rooms, a front room, a large middle room where we all slept, and a small kitchen at the back. The bathroom was an outdoor outhouse. My mother and sister slept on a bed, while my brother and I slept on a mattress on the floor. The first night we moved in, a fire had broken out across the street. Half the block was ablaze, with firemen and police all around. It was chaotic, but we settled in as best as we could. Our new life in Phoenix was humble. Even though we didn't have much, we made the best of our time together. The evenings were filled with good home-cooked meals, and during the day, my brother and I explored our neighborhood. We were fascinated by our surroundings, the industrial sites, the sounds of trains and machinery, and the strange, eerie quietness at night. The brewery down the street emitted a constant sound of heavy machinery moving and steam hissing. At night, the sounds echoed, and we'd drift off to sleep listening to the trains and the brewery's distant hum. The desert had its own unique charm. Dust storms and lightning filled the sky in the evenings, and we'd sit inside watching the storms through the windows, eating watermelon. Our middle room door, the one that led to the outhouse, was secured by only a small hook latch. At night, my mother or sister would sometimes need to use the outhouse, but my brother and I avoided it. We hated going out in the dark, so we used an old Folgers coffee can next to our mattress instead. One particular night, as we all lay in bed, I heard the wind picking up outside. It rattled the windows and doors, especially the door that led to the outhouse. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but then I heard the latch on the door give way, and it swung open. I heard my mother get up, muttering under her breath, "TSK," as she went to close the door. I heard her latch it again and crawl back into bed, and everything became quiet. But I couldn't fall back asleep. I lay there listening to the usual sounds, the trains in the distance and the brewery down the road. As I lay thinking, I heard something else. The floorboards creaked. I froze and listened carefully, but there was silence again. Then another creak. My heart started racing. I looked over at my brother, but he was sound asleep. Another creak followed by a soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I pulled my blanket up closer and thought for sure my mother would wake up soon. I shoved my brother to wake him, but he just mumbled and turned over. The shuffling continued, and then I heard a faint thump. Someone was slowly stepping through the room. Terrified, I pulled the blanket over my head and curled up tightly, hoping it was just a dream. Then, I heard the clink of metal. I dared to peek out from under my blanket and saw, right by the coffee can, a black boot. I panicked and pulled the blanket over my head again, my body shaking with fear. A deep voice broke the silence. "I am from Indian Road," it said. "I am from Indian Row." I squeezed my eyes shut and held on to my brother, trembling until I eventually drifted off to sleep from sheer exhaustion. When morning came, I told my mother about the man in the house. She looked at me like I was crazy and said, "It was just the wind. The door blew open, that's all." But I knew what I had seen and heard. I tried convincing her it was real, but she brushed it off as my imagination. Over the next few months, my brother and I continued exploring the neighborhood. It was a mix of excitement and strange feelings. Sometimes, while we played, I'd get a sudden rush of energy, a sense that something was coming. My brother would laugh it off, saying it was nothing. But deep down, I felt it, an overwhelming force of negative energy rushing toward me out of nowhere. At a birthday party with our new friends, I felt that same force wash over me. One moment I was laughing and having fun, and the next, I was hit with a deep wave of sadness and fear. I had no explanation for it. My brother had to walk me home, and I collapsed onto the couch, falling into a fitful sleep. It was during that sleep that I had a strange experience. I dreamed, or perhaps it wasn't a dream, that I was floating in an abyss, with a vast empty void stretching out beneath me. There was no sound, just an eerie, smooth sensation surrounding me. Then the void began to wrinkle, and the quiet was broken by the sound of the evaporative cooler's blades above me slowing down. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sound of the cooler blades synced with the sensation in the void. I could feel the wrinkles spreading across my body, and the sound became faster, more intense. Voices began to fill the room, angry voices, fast and loud. They mingled with the fan and the wrinkling void, all swirling together in a crescendo that was overwhelming. I shot up off the couch and ran out of the house, screaming, "The big ball is coming AFT or me." People from the neighborhood watched as I ran down the street in my underwear, screaming at the top of my lungs. My sister and brother caught up with me and brought me back home, where they put me back on the couch. I was burning up with a fever, and my sister gave me baby aspirin to bring it down. But the nightmare started again, and I ran out into the street once more, screaming. This time, an older man caught me and helped my siblings bring me home. My fever was high, and my mother took me to the doctor the next day. He gave me a penicillin shot and said the fever was causing hallucinations. But even after the fever subsided, the nightmares continued for months. An old Mexican lady visited my mother one day and told her that the duplex next to ours had a dark past. A man had killed his family there before taking his own life. It made me wonder if that had something to do with the strange experiences I had. I later found out that we had moved to Phoenix to escape my abusive father, who had terrorized us in Colorado. My mother had accidentally killed him in self-defense after years of abuse, and she spent 3 years in jail before moving us to Phoenix to start over. I never had another visitation, but my awakening nightmares didn't stop for 5 long years. During the first year, my health deteriorated drastically. No matter what my mother or the doctors tried, nothing seemed to work. My nightmares didn't just affect my nights, they haunted my waking hours too, leaving me physically weak and emotionally drained. The nightmares would come in waves. Sometimes I'd get a few days of peace, but then they would return with such intensity that I couldn't escape them, night after night. For 2 weeks straight. I lost so much weight that year that my mother had to put me on vitamins to slow down the deterioration. Antibiotics weren't doing anything to help. During the day, I tried to go about life as normal as possible. I would play cars with my brother in the yard, pretending to be just another kid enjoying his childhood. But there was always a shadow hanging over me, a lingering fear in the back of my mind, reminding me that night would come again. And with night came the terror I couldn't escape. I became terrified of the dark, terrified of what might be waiting for me as soon as I closed my eyes. Some nights, I would lie in bed, my heart pounding, waiting for the nightmares to come. Sometimes, nothing happened, but just when I'd let my guard down, they'd come back. This cycle went on for what felt like an eternity. One day, an old Mexican bruta lady from the neighborhood named Donna Maria came by to visit my mother. Word had spread about the little boy who would run through the streets screaming at night, and Donna Maria was curious to see me for herself. She spoke mostly Spanish with only a little English, but she understood enough to talk to my mother about what was happening. She looked at me closely and told my mother that I was weak and sensitive, and that something was afflicting me. What came next was unexpected. My mother, desperate for help, allowed this woman to take me to her home. I spent the next 6 months living with Donna Maria. Every morning, afternoon, and night, she would pray with me. She taught me how to pray in both Spanish and English, teaching me the Our Father and the Hail Mary. These prayers became a routine, a daily ritual that brought me a sense of comfort. While we weren't praying, I learned Spanish from her, and she took great care of me. I was well fed and had wonderful meals during my stay with her. During those 6 months, something miraculous happened. My nightmares stopped completely. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace. But peace, as it turned out, wasn't meant to last. After several months, something changed. One morning, Donna Maria asked me, "Was that you walking around last night?" I had no idea what she was talking about, and I told her so. But the question didn't stop there. For the next few weeks, every morning she'd ask me the same thing. "Why are you walking around at night? What are you doing?" And every time my answer was the same. "It's not me. I don't walk around at night." The situation took a strange turn one morning when she woke me up, visibly agitated. "Come with me," she demanded. "I want to know what this is." She led me to the bathroom, where on the floor outside the door was a pile of feces. I had no explanation for how it got there, and neither did she. I could see the concern in her eyes as she stared at the mess, but I couldn't give her any answers. Soon after this strange incident, I was sent back home. The moment I returned home, my nightmares came back with a vengeance. It was as if whatever force had been tormenting me knew I was vulnerable again. The nights became long and terrifying, filled with the same vivid, awakening nightmares that had haunted me before. After my nightmares returned, my mother couldn't handle it any longer. She had to work, and she couldn't afford to miss any more days, so she sent me to live with my aunt. I stayed with her for 2 months, and during that entire time, I didn't have a single nightmare. It was as if my aunt's house was a refuge from whatever was plaguing me. I could sleep in peace for the first time in ages, but after 2 months, I had to go back home. The peace I had felt at my aunt's house was short-lived. Just 2 days after returning home, the nightmares hit me again with full force. It was as if they had been lying in wait, ready to pounce the moment I stepped back into the house. My nightmares didn't let up for years after that. My sister and brother started school, but my mother thought it was better to keep me home until my health got better. I spent my days with the old Mexican lady and praying. When I wasn't praying, I was feeding her cats. Yet, sometimes at home, my nightmares would come with such incredible force that I couldn't control my fear, and I talked to myself as I walked from room to room. As always, the next day I would avoid everyone in the family and go off by myself and play cars alone. One day, my mom and her boyfriend took me for a long drive across the city to live with my aunt. My mother told me the reason I was going to live with my aunt was because they had a bigger house and a bigger family, and there would always be someone at home to watch over me day and night. At first, my aunt was calm and understanding when I paced the house in the middle of the night ranting and talking to myself. Yet not one of my cousins ever woke up to help me. My aunt was the only one that woke up and took care of me when I would rant and murmur to myself in the middle of the night. But after more than a week of me walking and talking in my sleep, my aunt began to worry. She asked me one morning if I was just having dreams or fantasies and dream walking, and was that really me talking and muttering in weird voices in the middle of the night? I said yes, it was me, and it was because I was homesick and wanted to go home. A week later, I was home again. It felt so good to be home again. But a week later, to my disappointment, my mother sent me to live with my uncle and aunt in Las Vegas, Nevada. Although I was homesick, I loved living in Las Vegas in the 60s, and I never had another dream-wake nightmare. A year later, I was back home again in Phoenix. After being home for a year, one night there was an incredible loud piercing scream that woke everyone up with a bolt. It was my sister. At the same time she screamed, I saw what I thought was a black cat jump on my mattress, leap on the floor in front of the mattress with a thump and crash through the open window, tearing away the screen to the outside, and run away with such incredible speed it was nothing more than a blur. My mother's boyfriend came running into our bedroom in his underwear with a shotgun in his hands and went running out the back door of our bedroom. When I turned and saw my mom holding my sister in the doorway to the kitchen, my sister was on her knees screaming hysterically. We heard 2 shotgun blasts go off somewhere down the street. When my mother's boyfriend came back, my mother asked if he shot someone. He said no, but he decided to pull 2 shots off just in case there was someone out there, just to let them know we had a gun. My mother called the police, and we were all awake and listened to my sister tell the police what happened. It was 5 in the morning. She said she was asleep when she suddenly felt someone come into the room. At first she thought it was my mother's boyfriend, but then she thought it was odd that he came home through our bedroom when he usually came in from the other part of the house where my mother slept. Still, she assumed it was him. Then she thought she heard a dog. Maybe a dog my brother and I had brought home. We were always bringing stray animals home. Then she felt a man touching her legs, and that's when she began screaming. After the police left, she told my mom and us a more detailed account of what she experienced. She said that once the breathing began from somewhere in the room, it became louder and louder, yet everything still felt normal. She tried going back to sleep. The breathing got louder and heavier. She looked over at me and my brother sleeping on the mattress on the floor and thought one of us must be having a bad dream, and our breathing was louder than it usually was. She tried again to fall asleep. Then she heard the breathing slowly come closer to her. In her dream state, she thought she heard a dog panting. A dog had come into the house. She thought my brother and I had snuck a dog into the house. As she tried going back to sleep, her last thought was that it was funny. The breathing got louder and closer to her, and the panting seemed so close that she felt what she thought was a dog panting over her. She smiled and was getting ready to pet whatever dog she thought my brother, and I snuck into the house when she saw a black shadow of a man leaning over her, rubbing her legs. That's when she began to scream. To the police's credit, they did come by every once in a while to check on my sister. They never caught whoever it was that broke into our house. It seemed as I got older, my dream nightmares became less and less. They became few and far in between. My last one was at 12 years old. Not something you would not mark on your memory. Nevertheless, one night around 1 in the morning when my mother was still at work and I was reading a book, I fell asleep with the book on my chest and fell asleep. My sister came into my bedroom and shook me awake. Her hands were shaking. "There's a man in the alley." "What?" "There's a man in the alley." We walked into the kitchen and I turned the light off, and I pulled a corner of the curtain and looked into the backyard. Standing in the alley between the empty house and our house, I saw a black shadowy figure with a trench coat looking towards our house. I went into my bedroom and took out a .38 Llama pistol I kept under my mattress and walked back into the kitchen and pulled the curtain aside. There was no one there in the alley, yet even with my gun, I was afraid to go out looking for him. I slept in the front room on the floor in front of my sister's bedroom with my pistol. After 11 years, everything suddenly stopped. When I was 12, my mother married her boyfriend, who became my stepfather. Together, they had 2 beautiful little girls, my stepsisters. Life seemed to shift. My mother became busier than ever, working 2 jobs, and we hardly saw her. My stepfather worked long hours too, and I quickly learned that he had no tolerance for my fevers or my nightmares. Like my brother and sisters, I attended school, but the nightmares still came, often with the changing seasons. I struggled, trying to push them to the back of my mind, but sometimes they hit with such force that I couldn't resist. They would consume me completely. I'd pace, mutter to myself, and feel trapped in a battle I couldn't win. In those moments, I would finally give up and let myself be taken into the abyss. The last awake nightmare I experienced came when I was 12. It was the middle of the night, and in sheer desperation, I woke my stepfather, begging him to help me. I felt this intense, heavy presence in my room, an entity that I couldn't fight on my own. I paced from room to room, trying to escape it, but my stepfather didn't understand. Angry and frustrated, he grabbed my arm and dragged me from room to room, demanding I show him whatever it was that I was talking about. But it wasn't something I could point to. It was a feeling, a suffocating presence that took hold of my heart and mind. I pleaded for his help, but instead, he snapped. He told me to stop with the nonsense, that my mother and the entire family were sick and tired of me. 2 weeks later, I ran away from home. Like most kids who no longer have a place to call home, I returned now and then, but I mostly ended up on the streets. Through my teenage years, I fell in with ghetto gangs, drifting further and further from the life I had known. At 16, I was arrested for pistol whipping a security guard. It was the 1960s, and back then, there were no reform schools, only boys' prisons. I was sentenced to 2 years for assault and battery. During those 2 years behind bars, something strange happened. I didn't have a single waking nightmare. The abyss still haunted me in my dreams from time to time, but that overwhelming rush of energy that used to consume me at night was gone. When I was released, I returned home to my family. By then, my stepfather had left my mother, taking my 2 stepsisters with him. My older sister and brother had both married and moved on, so it was just me, my mom, my 2 younger sisters, and my younger brother. One night, after I had been home for 2 months, I went to bed after reading a book. I fell asleep with the book resting on my chest. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up, feeling the room was too warm. I opened the window next to my bed to let the cool air from the swamp cooler circulate through the room. I went back to sleep, but then I had the strangest dream. In my dream, I felt sluggish, like I was drugged, stuck in a space between being awake and asleep. I didn't see anyone, but I sensed someone ripping the screen from my window and lifting it. I saw a shadowy figure step over the windowsill and into my room. He moved slowly, his figure passing by my bed and into the hallway. I thought it was just part of my dream, and I drifted back to sleep. Then I heard a scream. I shot up in bed to see my youngest stepsister screaming in the hallway, directly across from my bedroom. Instinctively, I reached under my mattress, grabbed my .38 Llama handgun, and bolted down the hallway. I saw the shadowy figure dash out of the front door. Without thinking, I chased after him, firing my gun into the air as I ran down the street. The figure disappeared into the night. That was the last time I ever experienced a visitation. When I was 19, I met a girl, and we moved in together. Her family owned a Mexican restaurant, and we lived in a small trailer behind it. I never had another waking nightmare, nor did I sense another entity again. The strange experiences that had plagued me throughout my childhood simply vanished. Now, at 63 years old, I find myself reflecting on my life, on the friends, family, and lovers that came and went, and on the experiences that shaped me. Even today, those 11 years of waking nightmares still fascinate me. I once read a quote, "He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he become a monster." And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. I don't remember who wrote it, but it has always stayed with me. My story takes place nearly 2 years ago, in the spring of 2008. For quite some time, I had developed the habit of visiting cemeteries to relax, sometimes with friends and sometimes alone. Cemeteries were a peaceful place for me, somewhere I could be alone or have deep, intellectual conversations without being disturbed. I was always respectful, making sure never to disgrace a grave or cause any trouble. There was one particular cemetery I frequented regularly back in 2008, visiting 2 or 3 times a week. I usually went with a friend, whom I'll call Michael. Michael and I would sit on the driveway, talking for hours about life, humanity, and various other topics. One evening, we arrived around 7:00 p.m. and had been there for about 10 minutes when, suddenly, I was overcome with a strong sense of panic. Without explanation, I urgently told Michael that we needed to leave right away. This was unusual, as we had always had calm, pleasant experiences at the cemetery. Michael was confused, but seeing how serious I was, we left immediately. Later, we tried to make sense of my sudden fear, but neither of us could come up with any valid explanation. The next day, Strange things started happening, beginning when I got to work. For a few days, I felt as though I was being followed everywhere I went, whether to the break room, the restroom, or the lunchroom. Each time, I would turn around, fully expecting someone to be behind me, but no one ever was. Shadows appeared around me constantly for about 2 weeks. On 2 occasions, while sitting at my desk, my chair was shoved forcefully from behind, pushing me into my desk. Strangely, I was alone in my department at the time as my coworkers were at lunch. I began questioning my sanity until things escalated further. In front of my coworkers, pens, papers, and anything on my desk would suddenly fall off. People in the office started joking that I was haunted. As unsettling as it was, having witnesses made me feel somewhat reassured that I wasn't imagining things. The final straw came about 2.5 weeks after my visit to the cemetery. It was around 10:30 at night, and I was lying in bed with the lights off, texting friends. My door was open, as I usually left it for my cat to come in. I was waiting for a friend to pick me up, and decided to take a quick nap before they arrived. Barely 2 minutes into my nap, I was jolted awake by my mattress shaking at the foot of my bed. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to wake me. Initially, I thought it was my cat, but I quickly realized it wasn't. I have never run out of my house faster. After that night, I knew I had to do something. Afraid to go home, I was also worried that whatever was happening might follow me. It felt silly, but in desperation, I spoke out loud, asking whatever was haunting me to leave me alone. I explained that I hadn't meant any harm or disrespect by entering the cemetery. Miraculously, it worked. Since that night, I haven't had any further experiences. I learned an important lesson from this experience. Sometimes hanging out in places that are spiritually active, like cemeteries, can lead to unintended consequences. This is my first time sharing a story here, and after reading the fascinating experiences, I felt inspired to tell one of my own. I'm 24 years old now, and for the past 16 years, I've had some interesting, and at times frightening, paranormal experiences. When I was younger, I occasionally saw what I can only describe as ghosts in a house where I lived for about 9 years. These sightings only happened about 4 times, with 2 of them being the same ghost. These weren't your typical transparent apparitions. They looked so real that I even tried reaching out to grab one. Although I haven't seen anything like that in the last 11 years, I've always had a strong sense of when a place had an odd or eerie energy, and it often turned out that those places were haunted. Now, I'll get into the actual story. This particular experience happened almost 3 years ago in Arizona. I had been spending time with a friend I had recently met, and we decided to go back to his grandmother's house, where he lived, to listen to some music and relax. The moment I walked into the house, I was hit with an overwhelming urge to run into the kitchen. I felt an unusual surge of happiness and comfort, which was strange. Even when my friend asked me to help pick out some music, I felt an odd pull to stay in the kitchen. I eventually helped him with the music, but quickly returned to the kitchen right after. Within a minute, I sensed 2 distinct presences, a man and a woman. Without thinking, I asked my friend, "Who is Paul?" I started telling him all sorts of things about this Paul, as if the information was being given to me by the man's presence. My friend went pale, literally. He explained that Paul was his grandfather's name, and that he had passed away in this very room only a few months before. His grandmother had even mentioned that she often felt Paul's presence in the house. There was no way I could have known any of this, as I had just recently met my friend. And it's not exactly the kind of thing people casually mention. We continued talking and hanging out, but after a while, I sensed the female presence had left. Then things became even stranger. I started feeling like Paul could read my thoughts, as if he was somehow entering my mind. I know that sounds far-fetched, but I can only describe it as though he was invading my brain. It became increasingly uncomfortable, and I started getting worried, wanting to leave the room. We eventually left the house, and as soon as we did, that odd sensation went away. I'm only 17, but I've experienced quite a lot of paranormal activity. At first, it wasn't anything too serious. Just a few things that went bump in the night. Nothing too big, you know. But everything changed last year, in 2009, when things started getting scary. At the beginning of the year, I experienced what they call sleep paralysis, or at least that's the name given to it. As a Christian, I believe in demons, angels, God, the devil, and all things spiritual. So when sleep paralysis first happened to me, I was pretty freaked out. I'd heard family members talk about the feeling of being held down during sleep, and it scared me, especially since I have cousins who had experienced demonic possession. I always thought it would never happen to me, but I was so wrong. My experience was similar to a lot of the stories I've read. However, I could actually open my eyes. I tried calling out to my younger sister, who shares a room with me, but nothing came out. I tried to move, but again, I couldn't. When I finally broke free from the paralysis, I jumped up, looked around, and then drifted back to sleep. The second and third experiences were a bit blurry, but the fourth one stands out. It happened while I was at my grandparents' house. I was taking care of my grandma while my grandpa went out to get a few things, and I fell asleep on the floor. I don't know why, but I can sense when sleep paralysis is about to happen. It's like I can feel it coming. This time, something strange occurred. I felt a weird sensation, like a pleasurable feeling around my lower back area. But then it suddenly stopped. I opened my eyes and saw something black leaning over me, as if it was sitting on my back. It looked at me briefly and then quickly pulled away. As soon as it released me, I woke up. I was scared but too tired to overthink it, so I went back to sleep. November 28th, 2009, is a day I'll never forget. I lost a very good friend, and I'm still struggling to get over it. A few weeks after that, I was lying in my room, deep in thought, when I suddenly saw something flash past my mirror. I quickly looked around, thinking it might be one of my cousins playing a prank, but no one was there. I shrugged it off and went back to thinking. As I stared at the wall in front of my bed, I saw something strange. A black square, like a door, began forming. It was pitch black, even darker than my already dimly lit room. The black doors stood out in the darkness. Then I started seeing things running fast across the room, reflected in the mirror. I was terrified. I immediately started praying. When I opened my eyes, those fast-moving things were gone, but the door remained. I bolted downstairs to find my cousin and talked with her until I felt sleepy again. When I returned to my room, the door was gone. The next morning, I emailed my aunt, who has a strong interest in the paranormal, and told her everything that had happened. She said it could be my awakening. I didn't know what that meant, so I asked her to explain more. She went into detail, suggesting that I might have a gift, or that I was sensitive because of my friend's death, and my raw emotions. I'm not sure what it was, but I know what I saw. It all happened at the end of last month, late at night. My brother and I were home alone, as my mom had gone out to visit her boyfriend. I was getting ready for bed when my brother stopped me in the hallway, saying he wanted to show me something. The house was mostly dark, and I assumed it had something to do with his toy lightsaber. After a moment, I convinced him to let me go to my room. But as he walked toward the living room, he suddenly came running back down the hall, pale as a sheet. "What's wrong?" I asked. He kept staring down the hall. "I saw something in the kitchen," he said, describing a black figure with no distinct shape, but with glowing red eyes. My brother, Drew, has a pretty wild imagination, so I wasn't immediately convinced. I told him to wait outside my room while I checked something. Once in my room, I grabbed my pendulum. I've used it to get answers before, and it's always been accurate. I relaxed and asked it to show me yes and no, and once it settled, I asked if Drew was lying. The answer was no, which surprised me. I asked if what he saw was a ghost, and it answered yes. Then I asked if it was a negative spirit, and the pendulum swung to yes again. At that point, my first thought was, great, something bad finally got into the house. But I stayed calm and asked if the ghost was still in the kitchen. The pendulum answered yes. I left my room, holding the pendulum, and told Drew what I had just done. He followed me as I made my way to the kitchen. The living room light was on, so I could see into the kitchen, but I couldn't see the ghost. I asked the pendulum again if the ghost was still there, and it said yes. Standing my ground, I firmly said, "Whoever or whatever you are not welcome in this home. Leave." Everything went still for a moment. I lifted the pendulum and asked if the ghost had left, and the answer was yes, but I still felt uneasy. Drew and I went back to my room. Sitting on the bed, I continued asking the pendulum questions. Is the ghost still on the property? Yes. Does it wish to harm us? No. Is it mad? No. I was confused. My first thought was that if it's negative, it must be dangerous. But that wasn't the case. I then asked, is the ghost sad? The answer was yes. I regrouped, taking a deep breath. Drew remained silent, watching me. I asked, is the ghost a man? The pendulum answered no. Is it a woman? Yes. Then I asked, does she want to move on? Yes. An idea struck me. I asked if the spirits that already lived in the house, the ones my family had encountered before, wanted to help her. The pendulum said yes, so I asked if one of them could go out and bring her back inside, and the answer was yes. I turned to Drew and smiled, feeling calm. Are you okay with this? We'll help her pass on once Mom gets home. He nodded and said, yeah, I just hope we can help. A few moments later, Drew spoke up. The room just got colder. I had noticed it slightly too, but my room has always been the coldest in the house. I immediately apologized for being so pushy earlier, telling the spirit she wasn't welcome without understanding her situation. I asked if she was okay with staying in my room until my mom came home, and the pendulum said yes. We soon learned that she had been drawn to the house because of Drew's positive energy. He reminded her of her son. I asked if her son was still alive, and the pendulum answered yes. Then I had another idea. Drew, are you okay with her following you until Mom gets home? He gave me a strange look but agreed. I wouldn't mind. I asked the spirit if she wanted to follow Drew, and the pendulum said yes. Drew set his only condition. You can follow me, just don't scare me. With everything settled, I left a message on my mom's phone about the situation, and we went to bed. In the morning, after my mom came home, I explained everything to her. Surprisingly, though she usually ignores the spirits in our house, she seemed excited. I asked her if she could sense the woman, but she couldn't. Either the woman had moved on, or my mom just couldn't sense her. Curious, I grabbed my pendulum and asked, did the woman move on? The answer was yes. It seemed that simply being around Drew had been enough for her to find peace. When Drew woke up, I told him the news, and he was happy to hear it. It was an exciting experience, but even now, writing about it, I feel the same calm I did that night. We were able to help her move on, and I'm glad we did. In 2002, my sister and her husband, David, moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan. A year later, in 2003, David unexpectedly moved back to Phoenix with their 2 daughters. Without my sister, she had been having an affair with another man. Over the following months, they went back and forth between Michigan and Phoenix. One week they were together. The next one of them would be back in Phoenix. It was chaotic, but the family tried to stay out of their personal issues. Eventually, David settled in Phoenix with the girls. One morning, I stopped by David's place around 7:30 a.m. to have coffee before heading to work. I wanted to catch up on the situation with him and my sister. When he answered the door, he was visibly drunk, holding a glass of booze in his hand. He looked at me, almost closing the door in my face. A short time later, the girls returned to live with my sister in Detroit. Christmas was only 3 days away. I called my sister to ask about the girls and whether she had spoken to David. She said no, which didn't surprise me. Whenever I spoke to David, he would always tell me my sister wouldn't talk to him and that she always handed the phone to one of the kids. The day after Christmas, I was woken up around 5 a.m. by a phone call, something I've always dreaded because late-night calls usually bring bad news. It was the police. "Mr. Bruce?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yes," I answered. "This is Officer James with the City of Phoenix Police Department. I'm sorry to inform you, but we have a situation here that we hope you can help resolve." My heart sank. My immediate thought was that something terrible had happened to my sister and her kids, but then I remembered David was here in Phoenix. "Do you know a man named David last name?" the officer asked. "Yes, I do." "Is something wrong?" "Yes, there is. Can you come down to Good Samaritan Hospital emergency room?" "You there, Mr. Bruce?" "Yes, I'm here." "What happened?" "David committed suicide." I was in shock. The officer told me that David had listed me and my sister as his emergency contacts, and since they couldn't reach her, they called me instead. I rushed to the hospital. When I arrived, the emergency room was empty except for a nurse behind the reception desk. She called the officer, who came out to meet me and explained what had happened. On Christmas Eve, David had walked into the emergency room and asked if it was the right place. The staff told him it was and asked what his emergency was. David replied, "Someone's going to die." They made him fill out some insurance forms and called the police. David confirmed again, "This is the emergency room, right?" Then he pulled out a gun, put it to the side of his head, and said, "Well, you have an emergency now." And with that, he shot himself. My sister didn't answer her phone until 2 days after Christmas. I was furious with her. She hadn't spoken to David or let him talk to his daughters. When she finally picked up the phone, I asked her, "Have you spoken to David lately?" She replied, "No, but I saw him. He came by on Christmas Eve, ran up the stairs to give the girls their presents, and wished them a Merry Christmas. He told me he had flown in from Phoenix just for them. I waved at him from the kitchen, saw him with presents under his arms, and watched him leave with a glass of vodka in his hand." Then she added, "The strange thing is, on Christmas morning, there were no presents from David." I said, "Sister, that's impossible. You couldn't have seen him on Christmas Eve. David died on Christmas Eve here in Phoenix. He committed suicide. There's no way he could have been in Detroit." She started crying. After identifying David's body, I went with the police to his house to collect his personal belongings. It was devastating. When we opened the door, the place was filled with empty vodka bottles, piles of them, covering the kitchen, the sink, the bathroom, and even his bedroom. But the most heartbreaking sight was in his bedroom, next to the bed where he had spent most of his time. There were more bottles of vodka, and next to them was a stack of beautifully wrapped Christmas presents, labeled "From Santa," addressed to his little girls. That was too much for me. History was repeating itself. David had been an only child, and both of his parents had died in a house fire when he was 12. They had been alcoholics, and his Christian relatives had berated them for living an evil life. David had always hated those relatives. When I spoke to my sister, I told her, "Don't tell the girls their dad is dead yet. I'll send the presents from Phoenix, and you can say he was too busy to send them before Christmas. You can tell them later about what happened." I didn't want to ruin their Christmas. I wonder, what would you have done? My sister ended up having a son with her lover after David's death. She passed away at 57. My family and I moved to Tucson, Arizona for a job. Like my mother, I moved my family, my 2-year-old daughter, 1.5-year-old son, and a newborn, along with our 3 cats, to a 1-story condominium. We rented it sight unseen because of the urgent promises of employment. Due to the demand for me to start work immediately, we arrived in Tucson at 7:30 a.m., and I asked my wife to drop me off at my new job while she settled into our new home. My welcome at work wasn't exactly pleasant, but I won't go into that. At about 10 o'clock a.m., I got a call from my wife. She was upset. When she arrived at the condo, there were workers everywhere, and a man from Arizona State Environmental Services had told her we couldn't move in due to serious issues with mold and fungus. I told her to take the kids to a hotel for a few days while they finished the work on the condo. We decided to sneak the cats into the hotel room. 2 days later, my wife called and said, "All clear, we can move in." When I saw the place for the first time, as I backed up the U-Haul, I was immediately hit by an overwhelming negative energy, something I hadn't felt since childhood. Walking inside, I noticed an odd smell that I couldn't place. It was a mixture of overpowering perfume and something rotten that the fresh paint couldn't mask. It was unsettling. The worst part was the patio outside the bedroom. It was a strange sight. An old rock fountain made of desert stones sat in the corner, surrounded by dead cacti. Holes dotted the yard, which I was told were dug by desert tortoises, pets of the previous owners, who had supposedly left but occasionally returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. While exploring the small room off the garage, I found a tiny enclave filled with spray bottles and air fresheners. It was clear they had been used to mask something. Over the next 30 days, our newborn wouldn't stop crying, and both of our older kids became so ill that my wife had to take them to the emergency room for dangerously high fevers. One by one, all but one of our cats ran away. And the smell, it only got worse. Soon, I began to notice faint stains beneath the fresh paint, stains that looked like splattered blood, slowly becoming more apparent every day. They trailed from the bathroom down the hall to our bedroom. It was disturbing, to say the least. I spent a lot of time on the patio, trying to figure out why all the desert plants were dead. Desert plants are hardy and can survive with minimal care, yet everything was dead just 6 months after the previous owners moved out. There were 3 main reasons we packed up and left after just 30 days. First, my kids were sick the entire time we were there. Second, my wife discovered the worst of the musty smell came from the kitchen. When we pulled the refrigerator away from the wall, we found an inch-thick layer of green fungus covering the entire wall behind it. The final straw was the landlord. He came by every other day asking to access the dead space underneath the condo, which could only be reached from inside the closet in our bedroom. Something about it didn't sit right with me. After 30 days of this nightmare, I walked out on my job, rented a U-Haul, and packed my family until midnight. By morning, we were back in Phoenix. There are many more details to this unbelievable experience. Leave it to my wife, Christina, to dig into what was really going on in that house. One evening when I got home, she told me she had spoken to our neighbor about all the issues we were having. She explained everything: the strange smells, the sickness, the overall bad feeling in the house. That's when the neighbor revealed something shocking. The people who lived there before us weren't smokers at all. This was contrary to what our landlord had said when he tried to blame the smell on cigarette smoke, explaining that was why the house had been fumigated. In fact, the neighbor went on to say that the previous tenants were actually suing the landlord in court. It was more information than we expected, but it made sense considering the state of the house. Meanwhile, the landlord continued to show up every other day, always asking my wife to step outside with the kids, while he crawled under the house through the access point in our bedroom closet. What made matters worse was how sick our kids constantly were. That's when I decided to start documenting everything with pictures. This was before digital cameras, so I used a Polaroid. I won't post the photos of my kids out of respect for their privacy, but it was heartbreaking to see them with swollen, puffy faces and fingers as they played with their Christmas presents under the tree. It was Christmas of 1986, and just looking at those pictures now still breaks my heart. All I wanted to do was get out of Tucson as fast as possible. I took pictures of everything: the fungus, the strange stains in the bathroom, the hallway, and our bedroom. I did this because I wanted to pack up my family. move back to Phoenix, and get my deposit and rent money back for those 30 days. When I showed the landlord the photos of his fungus-ridden house and explained how sick my kids had gotten, and after my wife reported him to the Environmental Protection Agency, he had no choice but to return our deposit and rent in full. We packed up that same day and moved back to Phoenix. I might have left out too many details about our Tucson experience. To slow things down a bit, when we first arrived in Tucson, my wife was the one who went to finalize the details for our condo while I was dropped off at my new job. Less than 2 hours into my day, my wife called, upset. She told me there were environmental agency workers all over the house and yard, spraying things. The guy from the agency informed her that it wasn't safe for her or the kids to move in because of serious environmental issues with the house. After 2 days of this, I had no choice. The creative director wasn't there, so I asked the owner for some time off to help my family. She told me, "Go, take care of your family." When I got to the condo, my wife was standing outside with our kids, incredibly stressed. She said, "The environmental agency guy just left and said we can't move in." The condo was still full of people working on it. I won't get into too much detail about the conversations, but simply put, we spent the next 2 days in a hotel. When we finally got the clearance to move in, the place looked nice from the outside. Spanish southwestern architecture, fresh white walls, and tan carpeting inside. But something felt wrong. As we walked in, there were still workers polishing the kitchen tiles and steam cleaning the bathroom and hallways. The landlord explained that the previous tenants were heavy smokers and they were trying to clear out the stench. I was a smoker at the time, and I remember thinking my house never smelled like this. But then again, maybe we don't notice our own smells. I walked down the hall to check out the bedrooms. As I passed the bathroom, an old Mexican lady was scrubbing the shower floor. I greeted her, and she muttered something like "mucho plant," which I took to mean a lot of old dirt. But when I opened the Arcadia door from our bedroom to the patio, I felt an intense wave of negative energy. It was overwhelming. The patio itself was odd. There were holes dug into the dirt, and dead cacti everywhere. When I asked the landlord about the holes, he said, "They're tortoise holes. They used to come around looking for my wife and me. They were our pets." "Is your wife here?" I asked, wondering if she was nearby. "No, she died of cancer 2 years ago," he replied. "Those tortoises were her pets." I asked, noticing the dead plants around the patio. The garden was completely neglected. The only things alive were weeds and crabgrass. The landlord promised he would redo the patio, but he never touched it during the 30 days we stayed there. During those first days, I'd come home from work, help my wife unpack, and settle the kids. The condo itself seemed nice, but I couldn't shake that heavy feeling. As the days went by, things started to go downhill. Less than a week in, I got a call from my wife. She and the kids were in the emergency room. Our oldest son had a fever over 104 degrees. He wasn't the only one. Our kids were constantly sick, and the smell in the house kept getting worse. One night, while I was shaving, I heard a loud clunk from the shower. The metal soap dish had fallen out of the wall, and when I picked it up, the back was covered in black fungus. When I looked into the hole it had fallen from, I saw the entire wall was full of black mold. I should have been more concerned, but at the time, I brushed it off. Despite everything, we tried to make the best of it. Christmas Eve came, and even though our son was puffy-eyed, we laughed and joked that he looked like the Michelin Man. It was still a beautiful Christmas. We exchanged gifts, listened to music, and had a great dinner. But the musty smell lingered, especially in the kitchen. The next Monday before work, I emptied every trash can in the house, thinking that would help with the smell. But when I came home, the smell was stronger, and the fungus stains were spreading. The stains in the bathroom and hallway were slowly creeping into our bedroom. I went out to the shed in the backyard and found cans of antifungal spray and air fresheners. It was clear someone had been trying to cover up the problem for a long time. The house wasn't haunted in the typical Hollywood sense, no moaning ghosts or eerie sounds in the night. But something was deeply wrong. You have to understand, not all hauntings are like what you see in the Amityville horror. Hollywood has a way of mocking real experiences with spirits or negative energies. That night, I talked to my wife. Even though I've always believed I have a bit of a sixth sense, I needed her input. "Shall we go home?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "Let's get the hell out of here," she said. "I'd like to share some of my experiences after reading other stories. I live on the Navajo reservation, and I often hear stories from friends and relatives. Growing up, I've had my fair share of scary experiences, but what happened on April 10th, 2010, was the weirdest and scariest yet. That morning, my mother was worried about my grandmother being alone at her house, which is about 13 or 14 miles outside Channel, Arizona. So, my father went to pick her up. Later that day, my parents took her out to Cortez, Colorado. You know, older folks and their casinos. But I decided not to go with them. I was enjoying having the house to myself all afternoon and evening. As it got dark around 8 p.m., I was starting to feel bored. There was absolutely nothing to do. That night, I made sure both of my parents' vehicles were locked, and I checked that the front and back doors, as well as all the windows, were shut and locked. Time passed, and by midnight, I decided to watch a little TV. I remember falling asleep on the couch with the TV still on. Around 2:50 a.m., I woke up, turned off the TV, and went to my room to change into my pajamas. After changing, I went to brush my teeth. As I finished up, I walked into the kitchen to turn off the light. Just as I reached for the switch, the clock in the house began to chime. It was 3 a.m. My mom has this clock that makes noise every hour. The moment the clock hit 3, I heard a knock at the front door. I thought to myself, who in the world would be at my house at 3 a.m.? I was confused but stayed calm. Then I heard another knock, followed by another. I wondered, should I open the door? As I started walking toward it, I got about 4 inches away from looking through the peephole when the knocking got louder. I backed away, my heart racing. Why didn't the security light come on? Our front door has a small entryway, so you have to step into that area to approach the door, and the security light always comes on when someone's there. But this time, it didn't. At that point, I was starting to get scared. As I backed away, the knocking turned into loud banging. It went on for about 2 minutes, and finally, I gathered the courage to approach the door again. I unlocked the top lock, but the banging got even louder. It felt like whatever was out there was about to break the door down. Terrified, I decided to turn on the outside light, hoping it would scare off whatever was out there. But it didn't work. The banging got even louder. I was ready to call for help, but instead, I hurried and looked through the peephole. The second I did, the banging stopped, and there was nobody there. In 1995, my wife, our 2 kids, and I were invited by some friends to spend a 3-day winter weekend in Payson, Arizona, in an old rustic cabin. The cabin was a few miles off the main highway, nestled deep in a beautiful pine forest. It was a beautiful place, decorated with a moose head over the fireplace, a bear head on another wall, and a deer trophy on another. There were several other wildlife heads scattered around, along with Indian blankets and a southwestern motif throughout. I assumed our friends had decorated it, but they said no, it came like that. The cabin itself was built with pine logs, from the walls to the pitched ceiling. It had a large living room, a small kitchen, 1 master bedroom, a bunk room for kids, and a loft with a drop-down ladder. The loft was where my wife and I would sleep. Our friends had invited another couple, and unfortunately, they had arrived before us and claimed the kids' room. That meant our kids would sleep on the couch and the floor in the living room under the fireplace, while my wife and I would sleep in the loft. The loft was small, just under the pitch of the roof, with 2 thin mattresses on cheap, fold-out metal beds. That night, we all played Trivial Pursuit and stayed up late, partying until 2 in the morning. When it was time to sleep, my wife and I were handed blankets and pillows, and we climbed up into the loft. The moment I entered the loft, I felt an energy. Nothing negative, just different. The ceiling was covered in cobwebs. The woman who owned the place called up to us. "I know it's dark up there, but if you want, you can light a candle." I agreed and asked for a candle. My wife and I settled on one of the fold-out beds with the candle lit on the floor next to us. As I tried to read a book and drift off to sleep, I grew concerned that the candle might catch the cobwebs on fire. So I blew it out and tried to sleep. During the night, I kept hearing a soft sigh and whimpering. At first, I thought it was my wife having a bad dream, so I nudged her and went back to sleep. But the whimpering continued throughout the night, quiet but constant. I nudged my wife again, but she shoved my hand away. That's when I realized the sound wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the empty bed in the corner of the loft. The sound was a quiet, sad whimper, followed by the occasional sigh. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and mournful. Hum, hum, hum. All night long, I heard it. Sometimes, my wife would wake up and tell me to stop, thinking it was me. But the sighing and whimpering never stopped. Eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep, only to be woken by my wife nudging me, saying, "It's time to get up." The light coming through the window at the top of the loft was so incredibly bright that I thought the sun had come up. But the light wasn't the warm, golden color of morning sunlight. It was a bright, glowing white. I turned to my wife to respond, but she was fast asleep. The next morning, over coffee, I asked my wife about waking me up. She said, "Did you see that? I thought it was morning." But then the light disappeared. It wasn't morning. It was the middle of the night. I went back to sleep. "Did you see it too?" I nodded. "Yeah, I thought it was morning." Later, when our friends asked how we slept, I told them about the strange light and the crying and whimpering I'd heard all night. My wife chimed in, saying she'd heard the sighing too. That's when the woman who owned the cabin told us the story of a young native girl named White Dove. White Dove had fallen in love with a white man who built this cabin for her, but the relationship had to be kept a secret because he was already married. He couldn't give her more than an affair, and she wanted more. When he left her to return to his real family, White Dove was devastated and committed suicide in the cabin. It sounded like a typical tragic love story, but after what we experienced that night, it didn't feel like a cliché at all. I was hanging out with a hip-hop artist at our recording studio, and somehow we went from talking about music and business to discussing life, which eventually led to the supernatural and personal experiences we've had. After that conversation, we decided to drive by my old house, where I lived about 5 years ago, where this story takes place. After doing some searching on Google, I came across stories similar to mine, so I figured I'd share it here. This story has 3 parts, but I'll only cover the first one here. The second part involves a strange mountain near my house, and the third part deals with a friend's house where we captured what we think are ghost voices. For now, let's focus on part 1, the window creature. This happened when I was a senior in high school, about to graduate and head to ASU. I was 17 at the time, and now I'm 23. My friend Richard would always tell me about the weird things he experienced around his house. Shadowy figures in his room, strange noises, and creatures running around in his backyard. He'd get so freaked out that he'd grab his shotgun and flashlight, running around trying to chase these things down. One time, he even told me he woke up on his roof completely disoriented. I never really believed him until one night, when I witnessed strange things at his house. Gates opening and closing by themselves, footsteps in the rain with no one there, and even a bullet casing mysteriously appearing in the backseat of my car. But the weirdest part came a few nights later, when I was back at my own house, which was just a block away from his. I was asleep, and you know how sometimes you hear real-life sounds in your dreams. Well, I heard scratching on a window in my dream, and it kept getting louder and louder. Eventually, I woke up, and the scratching stopped. I got up, went to the kitchen for a glass of water, splashed my face, and went back to bed. As I lay there, fully awake this time, I heard it again. The scratching was real, and it was coming from my window. I started to freak out because there were no trees or bushes near my window. I turned to face the window, and I noticed my blinds swaying slightly, probably from the ceiling fan. We had security lights and video cameras around the house, but what I saw next made my blood run cold. The light flashed on, and a shadow passed by the window, slowly and deliberately. It wasn't facing me, but I could see it clearly. I froze, unsure of what to do. As I sat there trying to process it, the shadow came back. This time, it turned and stared right at me. It had huge red eyes and a completely blacked out face, like it was wearing a hood or cloak, almost like the Grim Reaper. I was terrified. I ran to my parents' room and woke my dad, who's a Vietnam Marine veteran and an NYPD veteran of 20 years. He doesn't believe in this kind of stuff. But I was frantic. I told him there was something in the backyard, so we went out to check it out together. Nothing was there. We went back inside and checked the security camera footage. The cameras had been triggered right when I saw the figure, but there was nothing on the footage. No shadow, no person, nothing. I was confused and disturbed, but it didn't make sense until last night when the hip-hop artist I was hanging out with told me he had seen the same thing. He described it exactly how I saw it. Red eyes, black cloak. He even said it had grabbed him once, and he couldn't stop shaking until he prayed. I'm not a super religious guy, but that really freaked me out. I just went to what way is outside my window. Did Richard somehow bring this thing to me? Now, here's the real kicker. There's a mountain near us called Mummy Mountain, and it's a hotspot for weird things. I've had more strange experiences there than most people have in a lifetime. That's part 2 of the story, but I'll post that separately. And then there's the third part, which involves my recording studio. One time, we brought all of our gear to Richard's house to record, and we decided to try and capture some of the weird things happening there. We set up microphones all over the place, one in the garage, a few in the kitchen, and a sensitive mic in the family room. We spent hours trying to make contact with whatever was in the house. At one point, Nick, my bandmate, sat in the living room, trying to communicate with whatever was there. We were recording everything. Suddenly, I heard breathing, right in front of the mic. It wasn't coming from Nick. A few seconds later, Nick came running back into the room, freaked out, saying he heard howling in his ear. I listened back to the recording, and sure enough, there was breathing and a strange yell, like a ghoul or something. We kept hearing more faint sounds, but nothing compared to what we caught when we left the house to take a break outside. We played back the recordings later, and while we were outside, something moved inside the house. You could hear breathing again, and it sounded like it sat down on the couch. You could hear it shifting around, trying to get comfortable. It freaked us out when we realized we had walked right by it. Nick cleaned up the recordings, and we still have them. The first time we visited Mummy Mountain was a little before I ever saw the cloaked figure. I was about to turn 17 and was in my first band. I was hanging out with my guitarist, Jared, who I had just picked up from the coffee plantation where he worked. We were heading back to my house to write a new song when we saw a huge rectangular green fluorescent light appear on the mountain ahead of us. We both decided we needed to check it out. We drove up to the mountain, and as soon as we got to the road leading into the mountain community, the light shut off. We thought it was odd, but kept going. We passed an area known as the End of the World Drop, a steep road where you can't see the road ahead. Many friends have driven off this at night and crashed. Strangely, all of my friends knew about this place, but none of them had ever ventured left at the fork in the road. Since the light had come from that direction, we decided to turn left. We followed the winding road until we reached a gate at the other side of the mountain. This was a rich community with huge million-dollar homes, nicer than my parents' mansion. Some homes were under construction, while others were already finished. The community looked new, but the call box at the gate looked like it was from the 70s. The name of the community is La Place du Summit, which you can look up on Google. Jared and I got out of the car and noticed a security guard at the gate, so we waited. We found out that the security guard leaves every night at exactly 10:30 p.m., which we thought was odd. Why would such a rich community have no security at night? We decided to hop the gate once the guard left and started hiking up the road through the community, which leads near the top of the mountain. It was dead silent under the full moon. Along the way, we passed some strange-looking generators, like something out of a spaceship. Eventually, we reached a house with a huge bright light coming from inside. Jared urged me to check it out, so I walked closer. Peering through the window, I saw what looked like a borderless TV, floating in the middle of the room. It almost seemed like another dimension, showing a sunset scene. I got an eerie feeling that something was going to pop out at me, so I ran back to Jared. Next, we came across a house with confusing statues in front of it. When we turned around, we noticed another house below us. Inside the window, there was a bright green light. This couldn't have been the light we saw earlier, as this house was in a cove that didn't overlook the city. Inside the room, we saw what looked like an operating table with a large light above it, and a pendulum with a sharp blade at the end. This really freaked us out. There's a lot more that happened, so I'll quickly summarize the rest. Over the next few years, I visited this mountain about 30 times, with many different people, and something strange happened every time. I even have video footage of Richard and me at night, where we captured a strange shape running at us on camera. You can't see much, but if you pay attention, you can clearly make out a man standing in the brush as we drive away. I've also visited during the day with Jared to check things out. Once, we tried getting in through the gate, but the security guard wouldn't let us, even though we made up a story about a lost dog. So we decided to climb up the mountain from the other side. When we reached a house under construction, we heard babies crying or some sort of yelling, which you can clearly hear in the video if you turn the volume up. Strangely, the camera died right as we entered the house. One thing that has always stood out to me is that I've only ever seen white cars in this community. A few times, these cars followed us, and we had to hide under driveways to avoid being seen. At the top of the community, there's a statue of an eagle on a chimney. When you stand under it and look across the valley toward the other mountains, it lines up perfectly with an equilateral triangle of green dots. That was odd too. The last event I'll mention happened about a year ago. I went back with my coworker, my ex-girlfriend, and a big-time music producer named Ralph, who's produced for bands like Korn, Megadeth, and G-Unit. Ralph was skeptical the whole time and tried to scare us, but nothing strange happened until we got back to the gate. We were standing at the call box when we heard a noise coming from the bushes, like a cell phone ringing. My coworker, Hoagie, checked his phone, but it was off. He was taking pictures of the names on the call box when I started dialing random numbers. Every line was busy, except one. A woman answered the call. I asked if she had seen a dog, trying to make small talk. She quickly said no and hung up. Then the call box rang again, and this time, a man answered. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it sounded like, "They were just here." That's when we bolted. Back at home, Hoagie checked his phone, but none of the pictures of the call box names had saved. It was strange because all the other pictures worked fine. Then, about 15 minutes later, I got a call from Ralph. He said that on his way home, a blacked-out car followed him all the way from Paradise Valley to Chandler. He had to pull into a neighborhood, turn off his car, and lay low until the car went away. Coincidence? I don't think so. There have been so many strange things that have happened on Money Mountain. I've seen floating orbs, strange white cars, operating tables, pendulums, and shadows moving inside houses. It's beyond explanation. My experience happened about 3 months ago. I've always believed in the paranormal. I've seen things in my life that most people laugh about or joke around with. The truth is, there's another world out there, a spiritual world, and what I experienced still scares me to this day. Not a day goes by where I don't think about it. It all started with a book my sister-in-law insisted I read. Curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it and began reading. The book spoke about ways to summon spirits and communicate with them. It detailed rituals, sacrifices, and named demons that could assist in these practices. A few pages in, I realized this was too much for me. I returned the book, thinking I would forget about it soon. But I was so wrong. That night, I was lying in bed, on the phone with my boyfriend, when suddenly a violent gust of wind hit me from behind with great force. It made me feel incredibly cold and scared. The strange thing was, my window was sealed shut, so there was no logical explanation for the wind. I started to feel like something was watching me, and the fear inside me grew. I tried to call for help, but it was like I was paralyzed. Then, from within the wind, I could hear a vicious dog growling, and it was getting closer and closer. Deep down, I knew it wasn't just a dog. It was something demonic. I used to be a strong Christian, so in my mind, since I couldn't speak, I claimed the blood of Jesus. I told the demon that the Lord was on my side, and it couldn't take me or hurt me as it wanted to. I kept praying over and over, until I could finally hear my boyfriend's voice again. I asked him if he had heard anything, but he said it had been completely quiet, and he thought I had fallen asleep. But I knew what I had just experienced was real. No sound had come from me, even though I was screaming for help in my mind. I didn't sleep at all that night, and I knew I had opened some kind of door by reading that book. The days that followed only confirmed it. A few days later, I went on a camping trip with my boyfriend's family. I was relieved to get out of my room, thinking that maybe things would calm down, and I'd finally have some peace. But I was wrong again. Every night on that trip, the presence returned. It would sit at the foot of my bunk bed, growling. Each night, I fought to make it go away. No one else heard or saw anything, even though I was never alone. It was like it was only happening to me. As strange as it sounds, I felt like I knew this demon even before all of this started happening. I had seen it in dreams, and reading that book seemed to give it more power. Now it was coming after me, and I didn't know why. When I returned home from the trip, I called my sister and asked her to come over and pray for me. We decided to sneak the book from my sister-in-law's room and burn it while we prayed for protection. I'll never forget that day. As we began to pray, a strong wind tried to blow away the pages of the book we were tearing out. It took hours before the pages were fully consumed by the fire. When it was done, I saw the demon run through my window, and a huge sense of relief washed over me. Afterward, my sister and I talked about what we had just experienced. She described the demon as looking like a dog standing on 2 legs, taller than both of us, with red eyes and pointy ears. I had seen this demon before, but never so close. I was glad it was finally over, and that I could sleep again. Since that day, my sister-in-law hasn't spoken to me. She's gone out of her way to make sure I'm miserable, and I know why. It's because she shared this demon with me for a brief time, and I angered it. I only hope that one day she turns to God. My experience was quite puzzling. I know it was paranormal, but I'm still not sure exactly what it was. Let me tell you what happened that evening as I remember it with my family. Growing up, my family was close-knit. My aunts, uncles, and parents all lived on the family plot, a cluster of homes near each other, surrounded by livestock, sheep, horses, and some cows. We often had family cookouts on Sunday evenings, taking turns hosting. It was a chance to eat well and spend time together. We grilled meat, made side dishes, and of course, fry bread. One evening, it was our turn to host. I remember it being around 9 p.m. on a hot summer night. In northeast Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation, The sun doesn't set until after 9 p.m. in the summer, so there was still a faint glow from the sun behind the ridge about 30 miles away. I was sitting with my cousin and brothers, Alex and Jason, talking and laughing about something. I was facing the sheep corral, which was about 600 to 800 feet south of our house. The corral was made of tall wood posts, about 8 feet high, though 2.5 feet were buried underground, so only about 5 feet of the posts were visible. The gate was metal, welded into a square with bars in the middle, and covered with metal sheets, something common on the Navajo reservation, often used for hay barns, animal shades, and sheds. I was staring at the metal sheets of the gate, which were reflecting the last bit of light from the sun, making them stand out against the dark surroundings. As I was sitting there, spacing out and looking at the gate, I suddenly saw something walk in front of it. I sat up straight, blinking and squinting, trying to make out what it was. It looked like a man standing there in front of the gate. I couldn't tell if it was facing toward or away from me, but it was standing still. I knew we were sitting in the dark, and we hadn't been making much noise, so I doubted it could hear us. Without thinking, I stood up and yelled, "Look!" My uncle suggested it might be someone trying to steal or harm the sheep, which belonged to my aunt and her husband. So I got up to go investigate, but my dad stopped me. He and my uncles, along with my cousins, joined me, and we all began walking slowly toward the corral. There's a wash between my house and the corral, and from there, we could see the figure more clearly. It definitely looked like a person standing in front of the gate. My dad whispered to my uncles to split up, sending them to the left while we went right, and told us boys to approach straight on. As we moved in, the figure started running. Jason and I were closest, and we could see it clearly as we chased after it. It had the shape of a man, but as it ran, it sounded like horse hooves hitting the ground, not shoes on sand. We ran full speed, getting close to grabbing it. But just as we were about to catch it, it vanished, gone, just like that. By then, everyone had caught up, asking, "What happened? Where did it go?" It had a foul smell, like a dead cow or horse, the kind of stench you notice when driving past roadkill. We were confused. None of us could explain what we had just seen or chased. It looked like a man, but the sound it made while running and the way it disappeared made no sense. We retraced our steps with my uncle's flashlight, looking for footprints. We found nothing but our own, and near the corral, we only saw sheep and dog prints. It was strange. 7 of us had chased this thing, but there was no trace of it. I don't know if it was a ghost, a skinwalker, or something else entirely. All I know is that it was something that none of us could explain. One night, my sister, my friend, and I were feeling rebellious, so we decided to make a homemade Ouija board and try to communicate with the dead. We turned off the lights, lit a few candles, and used a metal ring, a Sharpie, and a whiteboard. We asked, "Is there anyone here with us?" No movement. We asked the same question again a minute later, and then again a third time. That's when it slowly started moving to yes. We freaked out, slid it to goodbye, flipped the board over, turned on the lights, and blew out the candles. Nothing major had happened, but we were scared. We shredded the board that night and threw it away. Around this time, my sister's boyfriend told her how dangerous playing with a Ouija board could be, based on his own experience. He was mad at her for trying it. A few weeks later, strange things started happening. My sister began hearing noises in her room, which was where we had played with the Ouija board. She claimed she saw a tall shadow watching her while she slept. She said it was so dark that it stood out even in her pitch-black room. It would be by her bed when she woke up in the night, so tall it touched the ceiling, and hunched over in a strange shape. Her boyfriend also mentioned that while they were together, she went into this weird, stiff state. She didn't move or speak, just stared at him. My sister didn't remember any of it, but she said she had seen the same shadow in the doorway of his bedroom before it happened. To make things even stranger, my sister had a dream where everyone was screaming, "They're coming. They're coming. Orneas is going to get all of you. The next day, she looked up the name Orneas and found that it was the name of a harassing demon mentioned in the Bible. I was so freaked out that I contacted someone I found on a website about the paranormal, and this is the email exchange we had. Underscore 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 underscore. From me. Okay, about 2 weeks ago, my friend, sister, and I made a Ouija board. We lit candles, turned off the lights, and did a prayer before we started. We asked if anyone was there. Nothing happened, so we asked again, and it slowly moved to yes. We got scared, slid it to goodbye, and flipped the board over. Later that night, we shredded the board and threw it away, but strange things have been happening since. My sister's boyfriend says she went into a trance for about 30 minutes. She wouldn't speak or move, and she doesn't remember anything. That same day, she saw a shadow figure in the doorway, at least 7 feet tall and hunched over. For almost a week, she's been seeing the same shadow in her room every night. She's really creeped out. She also had a dream where someone was yelling, "They're coming. Orneas and Noel are coming for everyone." The next day, she found out Orneas is a harassing demon. What should we do? Thanks. Erica. Easy. Her reply. Hi Erica. First, let me say, yipes and holy crap. You've gotten yourselves into a situation that probably felt innocent at the time, especially since you said a prayer before using the Ouija board. But as you've now seen, there are serious risks, even when dabbling a little. What you described, your sister going into a trance without her knowledge, is a form of possession. It's not a good thing. When you destroyed the board, you left the doorway open. Blessing the house is essential to close that doorway and prevent more visits from whatever else might be out there. Your sister needs to bless her living space as soon as possible and wear a religious necklace to keep this entity away. If the possession-like state continues, you may need to seek help on an exorcism level. And I'm not kidding. Here's what to do. Place a bottle of spring water in the sun for a couple of hours. Get a cross that can be worn later on. Go to the farthest corner of the basement or the farthest room of the house. Dip the cross in the water, splash it in the shape of a cross, and say, "Bless this home and keep out anything negative. In Jesus' name." Do this in each corner, along the walls, and over the windows. Do the door to the room last, so whatever is in there has a way to leave. Do this on every floor, and have your sister wear the cross for a couple of weeks. If she lives somewhere else, she needs to do this to her own space. Don't worry. You're not alone in this. Jesus doesn't let anyone down. If the problem persists, seek the help of a priest. Stay strong. Heidi. Underscore 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 underscore. After reading this, I was freaked out. I begged my mom to help me bless the house, but she said I was overreacting. A few months later, I began to wonder if my sister had made it all up. One night, it was too hot in my room, so I decided to sleep in the living room. When I woke up, I saw something darker than the rest of the room. It wasn't a defined shape, but something was definitely there. I was so scared, I turned around and buried my face into the couch. Since then, I haven't experienced much, just small things here and there, but nothing serious. Childhood house. This story continues from my previous one. After the incident where 3 entities tried to take my sister away, we started sharing a room. This room became our safe space, as I refused to sleep in the other room. Her crib was against the north wall, opposite the entrance door on the south wall, while my bed was on the west wall. My bed ran north to south, with the foot of my bed next to a large wall closet with wooden doors. It was in this room that I had my first encounter with a demon. One night, while I was asleep, I woke up to the sound of static playing from the closet. I was only 6 years old at the time. I looked over at my sister, who was sound asleep in her crib. The static was soft at first, but it gradually grew louder. Fear gripped me, and I was too afraid to open the closet doors. Instead, I ran across the house to wake my dad. In our house, walking anywhere at night felt like moving through a crowded place where everyone was staring at you, making you feel unwelcome. I hated walking around in that house, especially at night. When I woke my dad, and he came to check the closet, he also heard the static. The noise was coming from a toy microphone machine I had. The problem was, that toy didn't have any radio capabilities, and there were no batteries in it. My dad took the toy out of the room, and I never saw it again. The next day, I was in the closet looking for something to play with when I heard a loud bang from the top shelf. Boxes suddenly cascaded down, hitting me in the face and giving me a black eye. There was no logical reason for them to fall. The shelf was at least 3.5 feet wide, and the boxes were only 2 feet wide, placed all the way against the wall. My parents took those boxes out and stored them in the attic. A few days later, I returned to the closet, and again, there was a loud bang. This time, books fell on me, giving me another black eye. I was a little girl walking around with 2 black eyes, and finally, my parents removed everything from the closet shelves. One night while I was asleep, I had a nightmare. In the dream, a soft pink glow came from the back of my closet, and a demon appeared. He told me I had to do what he said, or he would hurt me. His first demand was that I kill my kitty. I refused. In the dream, I went to ride my bike, but he changed the scenery, and I was lost in the desert, unable to find my way home. Eventually, I returned home in the dream, and the demon left, saying, "See, you have to do what I say." He then commanded me to kill my mom and my kitty. Again, I refused and began to struggle with him. It felt like a battle for my soul. Though I had never been to church and my mother was a witch, so I wasn't taught about angels or demons, something inside me knew to call out for an angel. Apparently, I was being very loud because my mother burst into the room to find me drenched in sweat, crying and screaming for an angel. I never got my angel, but somehow, as a 6-year-old, I defeated the demon on my own. The next day, I had a fever of 105 degrees and was sick for a week. After that, I refused to sleep in that room ever again. The house never felt right. I was always afraid to walk around at night. One night, in desperation, I decided to sleep in the living room alone, keeping the TV on for light. The feeling of being stared at was so strong that I arranged the couch pillows to hide myself. As I drifted off to sleep, I heard someone sit on the opposite couch. My dad was at work, and my mom and sister were asleep in their room, so I knew it wasn't them. I broke into a cold sweat, paralyzed with fear. I could hear the thing breathing, but I couldn't bring myself to look. Somehow, I fell asleep and had a dream about a skeleton living in a car parked by my bus stop. In the dream, the skeleton beckoned me closer, and when I approached, its eyes glowed red, and a black mist rose from its face, chasing me all the way home. I jolted awake, finding myself staring at the ceiling. My protective fort of pillows had been dismantled. I lay there panting, and I felt a cold presence rush toward me, stopping just inches from my face. The front door suddenly opened, and my dad walked in, causing the presence to vanish. From that night on, I couldn't sleep in the living room either. I was running out of places to sleep. For a while, I slept on the floor of my parents' room, sometimes even under their bed. But something else found me there. It was an oppressive presence that felt like it was constantly mocking me. From the age of 6 to 12, I rotated between different rooms, never finding peace. By my teenage years, I wanted my own space. I had to choose between two rooms. Room number 1 and room number 2. I chose room number 1 and set everything up nicely. One night, I left the room for a few minutes to grab something to eat. When I returned, everything that had been on my dresser was now on the floor, but arranged in exactly the same way. As I sat there, trying to make sense of it, the curtain shade snapped up with a loud noise. I ran out of the room in a panic. For a few nights after that, I became a nomad again, sleeping wherever I could. Eventually, I moved my bed into the closet, slept with Christmas lights on every night, and kept the TV running. Every night, the TV would automatically turn itself off, despite my efforts to leave it on for comfort. Then one night at 3 a.m., my stereo turned on at full volume. The stereo had a knob to control the volume, but it was rotating by itself. It scared me so much that I stood up to turn it off, but as soon as I moved, it stopped. I lay back down, and it started again. This continued until I finally got angry and shouted, "Get the F at %# out of my room, and stop touching my stuff." The noise stopped, and I decided it was time for a new room. I made my sister switch rooms with me, so she could deal with the creepy ghost. Although things seemed fine at first in the new room, I developed insomnia. By this time, I was 15 and couldn't handle being alone, so I often had friends stay over. My insomnia got so bad that I started taking Excedrin PM every night, but even with 6 pills, I was too scared to sleep. 3 years ago, I received one of those dreaded phone calls that everyone fears. It was around 1:00 p.m. when the phone rang, a time when calls are answered without a second thought. But just as I reached for the handset, something stopped me. A gut feeling that froze my arm mid-reach for a split second. Then, just as quickly, the feeling vanished. On the other end was my sister Mary, bringing bad news. Our youngest sister, Sheila, was in the ICU at a hospital in San Diego, and she wasn't expected to make it through the night. Sheila had been checked in days earlier, but no one in the family had been informed until that morning. She was on life support, barely hanging on. Sheila had struggled with alcoholism for years, burning bridges along the way. I think she had given up, trying to fade away quietly without drama, without answering any painful questions, and without hearing lectures from people who had long stopped picking up her calls. The only 2 sisters she stayed in touch with were now on the phone, 500 miles apart, making promises to be there before she was gone. As soon as Mary and I hung up, the phone rang again. It was my oldest daughter, Angie, calling from work. She teaches high school English and never calls during school hours, but she was on her lunch break and wanted to check in. I told her the situation, and without hesitation, she offered to drive. I accepted, and we quickly made plans. When something like this happens, everything seems to move on autopilot. I grabbed my youngest daughter, Claire, as she came in and tossed her an overnight bag to pack. I called my husband, who would stay behind to take care of the animals and business. By 6:00 p.m., we were on the road, Angie driving, her partner Ruth in the front seat, and Claire and me in the back. Now, Angie is a stickler for rules. There are no gray areas for her, ever. Speed limits might as well be commandments in her mind, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I wanted to get to San Diego safely. My mother, on the other hand, was the worst driver. There's a tree in my hometown that she hit 4 times in 4 different cars. We headed south from Tucson to San Diego, switching from Interstate 10 to 8, only stopping for gas. We'd stretch our legs, use the restroom, and keep going. At one stop, I was washing my hands in the rest stop bathroom when I looked up into the mirror and froze. Staring back at me was Sheila. I had her wavy, long hair, mine is straight, and her sharp, pointy chin. I stood there, shocked. Angie walked in, saw me, and said, "Mom, you look just like Aunt Sheila." I nodded. "I know. Let's go." We hurried back to the car. Not long after, we hit a slowdown. Someone had tried to make a U-turn on the interstate, and their truck had lost a load of sheetrock. No one was hurt, but it added another 45 minutes to our already tense journey. By the time we got back up to speed, it was after 11:00 p.m. We had been listening to Angie and Ruth's CDs, but when they started discussing what to play next, I begged for the radio. They relented. Searching for a station in the middle of the desert at night meant we had few options, but we found an oldies station broadcasting from San Diego. After the commercials, the DJ came on and said, "And now, folks, here's the #1 song from way back in 1962. Before the song started, Angie said softly, "It's on, Sheila." And then Sweet Little Sheila by Tommy Roe began to play. I looked at the dashboard clock. It was midnight. Claire whispered, "Mom." Tears filled our eyes as we listened. Angie pulled the car over, and we all stepped out to look up at the sky. The stars seemed closer and brighter than ever that night. A few minutes later, Angie's phone rang. She answered, listened quietly, and then said, "Yes, we already know." She hung up. Sheila passed at 11:41 p.m. on September 7, 2007. Rest in peace, my sweet little Sheila. Rest in peace. For the past couple of months, something has been in my home, causing my family and me a great deal of stress. At first, I thought it was just sleep paralysis, a medical condition caused by stress or lack of sleep. But then things escalated. The entity was unknown to me, only appearing while I slept, and causing the typical paralysis. However, I didn't associate it with anything paranormal until one night, when my husband and I both experienced sleep paralysis at the exact same time. That's when I knew something was wrong. I eventually figured out that the entity was a polymorph. A polymorph is an energetic being capable of hiding itself by altering the energy it gives off, making detection difficult and allowing it to conceal its true nature. Anything that hides itself like this typically doesn't have good intentions. I'm still uncertain of what it wanted, but it seemed to be searching for something connected to me or my family, possibly tied to a past life, or something else entirely. I may never know. It first attacked me one night while I was sleeping, causing terrifying dreams. When I suddenly snapped awake, I saw a flash of light in the corner of the room and felt an oppressive, overwhelming energy. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, sitting in the corner, staring at me. For some reason, the only thing I said was, "You bastard. You're lucky I don't have my camera." I have no idea why I said that, but I was furious. Over the next couple of weeks, the house felt heavy. My cats were acting strange, walking low to the ground, and my dogs barked for no reason. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the activity stopped. But I knew the entity hadn't left. It was just hiding. Then, everything came crashing down. At 3 a.m. on Sunday, February 6th, I was in the kitchen baking brownies while my husband was in the living room watching TV. The house was noisy, with the electric mixer whirring away in a metal bowl, when suddenly, we both heard a loud, sharp noise, a mix between a growl and a scream, coming from the dining area. My husband joked, "Did you just kill a dinosaur?" I told him it must have been the TV. He replied that it wasn't possible. He had paused the show so I wouldn't miss anything. He assumed I had hit the metal bowl in some strange way, but I hadn't. The animals were nowhere near the dining room, and nothing had fallen or moved to explain such a noise. I shrugged it off, thinking it was strange but unimportant. We went to bed at 6 a.m. that night. I had a bizarre dream. A woman handed me a dead baby and told me to embalm it for a funeral. I'm an accountant, so this has nothing to do with my life. The baby was a little girl, about 9 months old, but it turned into a glass doll before I could begin embalming. Then the woman handed me another baby, smaller this time, which turned into a glass cat doll. When I set the cat doll down, it turned into a real cat, a large one with black and gray fur and glowing red eyes. Now I love cats, but this one terrified me. I tried to throw it outside, and although I succeeded, I noticed 3 of my other cats outside with it. The demon cat smirked at me, knowing I would try to save my pets. I opened the door to let them back in, and the demon cat slipped through too. I ran into my bedroom, but the demon cat broke through the bottom half of my door. It walked toward me, speaking in a deep, growling voice. I can't remember what it said, but I wish I could. Just as the demon cat approached me, my dog Loki appeared out of nowhere and attacked it, tearing out its stomach. As he ripped at the demon, it transformed into a skinny, black, hairless, 4-legged beast with razor-sharp teeth. The stench was overwhelming. Loki had killed it, and it lay there, lifeless, oozing a disgusting smell. I woke up in a puddle of sweat, hearing Loki barking and growling outside my window. The oppressive energy still filled the room. I yelled out, "If you don't get the $% out of my house, I will make you regret your very existence." I fell back asleep somehow, and the next thing I remember is my husband shaking me awake around 2 p.m. He told me to come into the living room. When I walked in, I was shocked. Our couches were moved. The lamp had fallen over. The rocking chair was knocked over. The coffee table was upended, and all of my cats were hiding in my office. Loki, who normally stays in the backyard, was standing at the front entrance, growling at thin air. Somehow, Ajax, our other dog, had ended up in the front yard. There's no way he could have gotten there without Loki escaping too, and Loki is aggressive toward strangers, so no one could have let Ajax out without getting hurt. Poor Ajax was shaking, absolutely terrified. After that night, the house felt much lighter and more comfortable. I believe the polymorph left, but I don't think it has left my yard. I'm worried it may try to come back inside, but for now, I'm doing everything I can to make it uncomfortable so it moves on. If it does manage to return, and I can't get rid of it, I'll consider asking one of my demon allies for help. I really don't want to inconvenience him, but if he's my last resort, I'll have no choice. This past weekend, something happened that freaked me out completely. I was really glad I was with friends, but it was definitely one of the weirdest experiences of my life. On the morning of February 11, 2011, I attended school. It was a half day, and one of my friends kept asking if I was going to the basketball game that evening. I wasn't sure, but I eventually told her I'd probably go. After school, my friends kept bugging me to join them, so I finally agreed. Around 6 p.m., I left home with some friends and headed to the game. We had a good time, but we got bored and ended up leaving around 8:30 p.m. There were 4 of us with 2 cars. After the game, we decided to head over to Canyon de Chelly. We parked our cars facing each other, got out, and wandered around the parking lot. My friends joked about hiking down into the canyon, but I quickly told them I wasn't going to do that, and they'd better not leave me alone. I was the only girl there with 3 boys, and I wasn't up for any canyon adventures. They eventually admitted they were kidding. Around 9 p.m., we started playing some sort of game, though I don't remember what it was called. It was fun, but the fun didn't last long. Suddenly, I heard one of my friends yell, "Get back to the car. Let's go. Hurry up." At the same time, I heard my other friends running. So I bolted toward one of the cars as fast as I could. 2 of my friends jumped into one car and sped off before I even had a chance to ask what was going on. My other friend waited for me, and as soon as I got into the car, he locked the doors and took off in a hurry. As we were driving away, we both heard a loud bang on the back of the car. We didn't dare look back. I asked my friend what had happened, but all he said was that he saw a dark figure staring at him. We drove straight to the nearest gas station in town, where we met up with our other friends. We all got out, and I started asking what had just happened. When we looked at the back of the car I had been in, we saw it was dented, with what looked like a handprint. After that, we decided to go back to the canyon to check if someone had needed help, or if it was something else. It was 9:54 p.m. when we headed back, this time in just one car and with flashlights in hand. When we arrived, There was a Jeep parked there, and a man, maybe in his 30s, was sitting on the hood of the Jeep, smoking a cigarette. We approached him, and one of my friends asked, "How long have you been here, sir?" The man looked at us and replied, "I just got here not too long ago. Maybe about 10 minutes. Why?" We told him what had happened, and he seemed genuinely surprised. He said he hadn't seen anyone and went back to smoking. We were just as surprised and, feeling tired, decided to leave. As we were driving away, we all looked back, only to see that both the man and his Jeep had completely disappeared. That's when I really started to freak out. We tried to reassure each other, telling ourselves not to think too much about it, but I haven't been able to get it off my mind since. This story is true, just as real as you sitting at your computer reading it right now. I come from a very religious household, and my mother, in particular, has always been insistent that ghosts don't exist. She firmly believes that all paranormal activity is the result of demonic forces. For as long as I can remember, I've been sensitive to other things. If my mother hadn't stifled my sensitivity, I might have developed into a medium. When I was very young, I had a recurring dream of a witch in my wall. Even today, I remember every detail of it. I would be staring at the wall when it would open up onto a forest with yellow birds in the trees. The yellow birds would transform into 2 yellow eyes, and as the view pulled back, I'd see a woman dressed in black with those yellow eyes, laughing at me cruelly. I'd wake up screaming, and this dream happened every Sunday night. As I got older, I developed an irrational fear of the corners where the ceiling and wall met in my bedroom. That was around the same time I started hearing voices. They would whisper my name softly, almost imperceptibly. I still hear them occasionally, though it no longer frightens me. I'll save those childhood stories for another time. This particular story is about something that happened when I was 14 and is something I cannot explain. At the time, my family and I were visiting my grandparents in Phoenix, AZ. My mom, always eager for us to learn, decided we should visit some ghost towns to better understand history. So we went to a ghost town and gold mine called Vulture City, near Flagstaff. Right from the start, the place felt creepy to me. I have 3 younger brothers, and while my second youngest, Sean, shared my unease, my other 2 brothers, Mike and Aaron, seemed unfazed. We arrived around 9 a.m. and began walking around the town. First, we visited the original mine shaft, which sloped 60 degrees down into the earth for about half a mile. You could still see the mine car tracks. As we approached the shaft, I felt like I was walking through something heavy, almost as if I was wading through water. My legs felt weighed down, and I had this strange sensation of both being drawn toward and repelled by the hole. Sean didn't like it either, so we decided to move on to the Glory Hole. The Glory Hole is the site of a tragic accident. In those days, stealing gold from the mine was punishable by hanging. 9 men had snuck back to the mine one night to steal gold ore by chipping away at the stone pillars holding up the mine. Over time, the pillars weakened, and one night the entire mine collapsed, burying the men and their 11 donkeys. No one ever recovered their bodies, and to this day, the area remains a crumbled hole. As Sean and I stood at the edge of the Glory Hole, I turned to say something to him. His eyes grew wide, and he pointed behind me, mouth agape. I quickly turned and caught a glimpse of a whitish figure in the corner of my eye, but just as fast as I saw it, it disappeared. It wasn't fog or mist. This was the Arizona desert in the morning. We didn't stick around after that. Our next stop was the town's infamous hanging tree. This ironwood tree was where people were hanged for stealing gold, though some stories say only a few men were hanged, and their crimes were much worse, like murder or rape. The tree stood across from the sheriff's office. Aaron and I walked under the tree when suddenly, Aaron clutched his chest and started coughing. He gasped for breath, saying something was pressing on his chest. I grabbed him and pulled him away from the tree. Aaron was only 8 years old, and he wasn't the type to make things up. We hadn't told him about what happened at the Glory Hole, so his reaction was especially concerning. When we told our mom, she didn't believe us and insisted we continue exploring the town. Finally, we reached an area where ore was processed for refining. The place was a mess. Old conveyor belts, rusty machinery, and random junk everywhere. The building was partially open, like a pole barn, with a roof about 9 feet high. As I was walking around, I heard a creaking noise overhead. I didn't pay attention at first, but then I realized the board was swinging in a way that didn't make sense. There was no wind, and yet the board would swing, stop midair, then swing again in the opposite direction. Sean was standing right under it, and he looked up just in time to see the board ripped from the wall. It floated for a split second before crashing to the ground with much more force than it should have. Sean jumped back just in time, his face pale. We exchanged worried glances but decided against telling Mom. She wouldn't believe us anyway. Not 2 minutes later, I was by the conveyor belt, looking at some old tools, when I felt a light tug on my jacket. "Aaron, cut it out," I said, assuming he was messing with me. But Aaron's head popped around the corner, and he asked, "What do you say?" I froze. Everyone in my family was in my line of sight, so who had tugged my jacket? Then it happened again. 2 sharp little tugs. I turned around, and as I looked down at the hem of my jacket, I saw it pulled outward, as if someone invisible was holding it. I watched in shock as it was tugged again. I screamed, bolted out of the shed, and stuck close to my dad for the rest of the day. A week later, when we got back home to Florida, I opened up an issue of Arizona Highways magazine and found an article about Vulture City. It was written by paranormal explorers who had experienced strange occurrences in the same machine shed where I felt the tugs on my jacket. The article mentioned that a little boy had died there, losing his head to a conveyor belt in the 1910s or 1920s, and his spirit was said to haunt that area. What's strange is that I had read that issue before our trip, but had no memory of the paranormal article until I saw it again. It was as if I had forgotten that part entirely, only to remember once we were home. It was the weirdest thing. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried to talk to the little boy. Maybe he just wanted a friend, or maybe he didn't like Sean but liked me. Who knows? One thing is for sure, I'm not going back to Vulture City to find out. My boyfriend and I had just moved back to the town we grew up in. All our friends had met this guy named Kyle and had been hanging out at his house quite often. One day, while a lot of friends were at Kyle's place, something strange happened. Our friend Josh had a vision and began acting it out as if he were living in it. He was on his hands and knees, acting as though he was getting stabbed behind the couch, where an X is marked on the floor plan. Everyone was scared and freaking out. I wasn't there when this happened, but I heard all about it later. My boyfriend had been there and witnessed it too. When I started visiting Kyle's house, they told me the story. Intrigued, I decided to verify it by using a Ouija board. The story was that a man had killed his wife and 2 kids. During one session, I contacted a little girl named Elizabeth, who helped confirm the story. After a few sessions, she told us that she wasn't allowed to talk to us anymore, because her mom didn't want her to. Eventually, we decided to reach out to the father, despite knowing he was a murderer. Although we preferred communicating with the victims, we pressed forward. One night, I saw the father's apparition, clear as day. I had just pulled into the driveway with a friend when I saw him through the window of the enclosed porch. It was dark outside, and I was scared, but I didn't mention it to my friend. We walked inside, and by then, the apparition had disappeared. Later that night, while playing the Ouija board in one of the bedrooms, I told my friend what I had seen earlier. She admitted she had seen him too. She described what he looked like, and it matched exactly what I had seen. It was a comfort knowing I wasn't imagining things. underscore 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 fatherly love. One afternoon, while all my friends were sleeping, I was on the couch painting my nails, just trying to pass the time. I kept hearing the front door slam. I would jump up, run to the living room door, and look through the porch window, only to see the door closed, but the chain lock swinging as if it had just been slammed. As soon as I checked the front door, I hear the back door and the kitchen slam. I kept running back and forth, trying to catch it in the act, but it always seemed just out of reach. Another night, I was sleeping on the couch at Kyle's house while Kyle and my friend Leah were asleep in his room. I heard loud footsteps that sounded as if someone was walking right next to me. The steps moved from the kitchen to behind the couch, exactly where Josh had acted out getting stabbed during his vision. It seemed to repeat every 10 minutes or so. I lay there stiff, too scared to move. Eventually, I yelled for Leah, who came and turned on the lamp next to the couch. She talked to me for a few minutes before going back to bed. I truly believe that this man killed his family and buried them under the house at the X spot. Kyle often complained about strange things happening, like dishes being thrown around. He would be in bed and hear dishes breaking in the kitchen. It was almost a regular occurrence at that house. Kyle's reaction was always to yell at the spirits, which I think may have provoked more outbursts. His lack of respect for them might have made things worse. One afternoon, I was playing Ouija in one of the bedrooms with a friend while my boyfriend was in the living room playing video games. He didn't know what we were doing, though playing with the Ouija board had become a common activity. Suddenly, he stormed into the room and yelled at us to stop. At that exact moment, a wooden cross sitting on the carpet next to him moved 90 degrees, right in front of us. In March 2009, my family and I moved into a house near Wickenburg, Arizona. It was a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with a tan exterior and an Aztec-like design. We had no knowledge of the land's or house's history when we moved in. For the first month, everything was normal. My mom often traveled out of town with my siblings, giving me some alone time. During those times, I didn't experience anything unusual. However, in May and August, things started happening. It was late May, and I was still in school. One evening around 9 p.m., I was reading a library book while everyone else in the house was asleep. Suddenly, I heard my name being called. It was my mom's voice, clear and loud, even though my bedroom door was closed. I was surprised at how well I could hear it, so I went to my mom's room and asked her why she called me. She told me she hadn't. Confused, I went back to my room. An hour later, I heard her voice again calling, "Destiny, Destiny, come here." I went back to her room to ask what she wanted, and again she said she hadn't called me. Another hour passed, and I heard my name being called once more. This time, I ignored it. Then, I heard giggling, like a little girl's laughter. Strangely, I wasn't scared. In fact, I felt happy. It was the sweetest, most innocent laugh I had ever heard. In July, while my mom was cooking in the kitchen, one of the cabinets suddenly fell to the floor. We had a handyman come to fix it, and he said it looked like someone had unscrewed the nails, but no one in the family had done it. As the handyman was trying to screw the cabinet back in, the nails kept shooting out of the wall, landing on the floor. This happened 3 more times before he decided to glue the cabinet in place instead of using screws. In August, my mom decided to sleep in the living room one night. Around 1 a.m., she heard 2 children playing tag. She heard the sound of them scuffling and running from the kitchen to the living room, where she was trying to sleep. That was the last strange incident we experienced in that house. We only lived there for 6 months and moved out in September. I've moved 3 times between the end of 2009 and 2011, and something has happened in each house. I'll soon share my family's experiences in the house we moved into after that. Do you think the ghosts in my house were friendly? I was born in Phoenix and lived there until I was about 8. We lived in a big house with a grapefruit orchard in the back, a main floor, and an upper level. The upper level had a landing that jutted out over the kitchen, where we had our TV and a daybed. During that time, I was often sick, and at one point, I was dealing with a stomach flu that lasted about 2 months. My mom had just given birth to my younger brother, and this all happened around the time of the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. When my mom brought my brother home, we were all nervous about what could happen to a large city like Phoenix if more attacks occurred, and that fear didn't help with what was about to unfold. 2 days after 9/11, I finally got the medication I needed and had to sleep on the daybed until I recovered. The first night passed without incident. I woke up the next day feeling nauseous, spent the day watching Thundercats, playing with my Barbie, and struggling to hold down any food, just typical kid illness stuff. Then nightfall came. Around midnight, my mom went downstairs to get some formula for my brother, who wouldn't stop crying, which was making my flu worse. I heard her put him in his playpen, where he began to calm down, playing with one of his toys. I then heard my mom in the kitchen, opening the fridge and moving things around. Suddenly, I heard the bottle drop, followed by a blood-curdling scream that erupted from the kitchen. My father, hearing the scream, jumped out of bed and ran downstairs while I crawled over to the ledge to see what was happening. Just before my dad got there, I saw a blonde woman in an oversized white shirt and socks, standing in the kitchen, staring at my brother and screaming at the top of her lungs. My brother, frightened, screamed and began to cry. When the woman saw my dad running toward her, she bolted for the screen door, which we always kept locked but slightly open. She didn't open it. She ran right through it and vanished. My dad stopped in his tracks, and my mom quickly picked up my brother and rushed back upstairs to check on me. A month went by without any further incidents, and I was starting to feel better. I was sleeping in my own room again, which was connected to my parents' room by a Jack and Jill bathroom. One night, I was sitting with my mom in her room, watching a movie. It was dark, my brother was asleep, and my dad was at work. Suddenly, the glass doors that opened onto the patio outside my parents' room slammed open, shattering one of the panes. It was raining and windy that night, but it wasn't windy enough to cause that kind of force. And then, we heard the wailing again. I ran to the window and looked outside, only to see the same blonde woman standing under the patio, screaming. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth was gaping wide, as if she were going to swallow the entire house. Terrified, I screamed and ran back inside, calling my dad and begging him to come home immediately. Despite my fear, I looked out the window again and saw her walking backward toward the orchard. Soon, the rain obscured her, and she was gone. That night, we stayed at my aunt's house. My dad returned to work, and my cousin took me out for ice cream to help calm me down. She listened as I told her everything that had happened. Later, I asked her to take me home to grab some clothes and my medication. As I hurried through the house, gathering my things, I kept glancing out the window at the orchard. The blonde woman was still there, sometimes standing with her mouth wide open, and other times sitting under a grapefruit tree with her face buried in her hands. I grabbed whatever clothes I could, clean or dirty, along with my Barbie and stuffed animal, and rushed out of the house, begging my cousin to wash my clothes when we got to my aunt's. I refused to go home for the rest of my recovery, staying with my cousin and aunt until I felt better. My wife and I moved into our first purchased home about 2.5 years ago. To be honest, I wasn't particularly impressed with the house at first, but she loved it, and the neighborhood was nice, so we went ahead and bought it. Over time, it started to feel like home, but some strange things have happened since we moved in. The first incident occurred about 6 months after we moved in. We had just finished dinner, and I was lying on the sofa watching TV. My wife was tidying up, and getting ready to do the dishes in our large kitchen/living room area. It's all one spacious room. She was about 5 steps away from the sink when, out of nowhere, the faucet turned on full blast by itself. She screamed and ran over to where I was lying. When I asked what was wrong, even though I already had a pretty good idea, she said, "The sink just turned on by itself." I got up, walked over, and shut it off. As I did, I felt a strange tingling sensation all over my body. At the time, I dismissed it as a reaction to something weird happening. Later, I researched our faucet system and concluded that it was impossible for it to turn on by itself, even with pressure in the pipes. It's the kind of tap that requires you to lift the handle to turn it on. To this day, I'm still not entirely sure how it happened. Other incidents followed. Our electronic picture frame, which displays a slideshow of our photos, has turned itself on mysteriously at least a dozen times. My wife got so freaked out that she unplugged it. We've never seen it turn on, but we often come into the living room to find it happily flipping through the slideshow. Then, just recently, I had a day off work, and when my wife came home, she asked why the garage door was open. I told her I hadn't been in the garage at all that day. We don't even park there. We mainly use it for storage and for my electronics projects. I closed the garage door and set the lock so it couldn't be opened by remote. I've never heard of garage doors opening by themselves, and I was home all day and didn't hear it open. When we first moved in, there was one room in the house that had badly stained carpet and a strange odor. We assumed it had been a messy child's room, but it also had a bit of a junky vibe to it. Shortly after moving in, when we were painting, I found a syringe, needle, and all, on top of one of the kitchen cabinets. It seemed like the kind of place someone might hide something they didn't want easily found. The location of that bedroom seems to be the center of some of the disturbances we've experienced. The most significant occurrence happened one night while I was sitting at the kitchen table, facing that bedroom. My wife was out with friends, and I had the house lit up with the TV, lights, and our laptop. I remember feeling a bit guilty for indulging in so many distractions at once, but I didn't stop. Then something truly unexplainable happened. I felt a presence come from that end of the house, circling around me as I sat at the table. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it. It was like static electricity moving through the air around me. It pulsed on the side where it stopped in front of me. I was almost frozen at the table, and finally said, "Okay, I acknowledge your presence, so now what?" It stayed for another minute or so, and just as I felt it starting to dissipate, I heard a loud banging on the window right behind me. I jumped up and opened the blinds, but of course, nothing was there. Now you might think it could have been someone banging on the window or maybe a tree branch. But that window is in our backyard, which is enclosed by a brick wall. It's in a nook behind a storage shed, so it's not easily accessible. For someone to bang on that window, they would have had to jump over the brick wall, hit the window, and jump back in about 2 seconds. Highly unlikely. Plus, there are no trees or anything that could have caused a repeated banging noise. Coupling that with the sensation I felt moments earlier, I'm calling it paranormal. We had a blessing ceremony when we first moved in, and we treated it with the utmost respect. Nothing scary has happened per se, but the window incident rattled me a bit. I remember thinking, this thing is toying with me. That probably disturbed me more than anything else. It felt like it was picking on me that night. Incidentally, that window is right next to the kitchen sink that turned on by itself. I've done some research on the house and haven't found anything unusual in its history. The house was only about 3 years old when we bought it, and a family or a couple lived there for about a year before we moved in. The house sat vacant for about a year and a half before we purchased it. I'm not sure if anyone died here, but I wonder if someone had an overdose while squatting in the house during the vacancy. I haven't found any evidence yet, though. Oh, and one more odd thing. The storage shed near the window has Louis spray painted on the roof in white cursive with a heart for the dot on the eye. I don't know who Louis is. There's no record of anyone by that name living here. I'm puzzled but curious. I'm not afraid of the house, and these incidents are random and isolated enough that they don't happen often. I'm almost positive that if something is here, it's peaceful. We recently got a small dog, and he occasionally barks randomly, mostly at night through the Arcadia door, and he's hesitant to enter certain areas of the house. That's all I can think of for now. It feels good to write this down and document these events. I'd love to hear what you all think. Feel free to ask questions. It might help jog my memory or provide more details. I live on the reservation, and strange things happen out here, especially since we live in the middle of nowhere. I have a lot of skinwalker stories, but this one happened just last night, and it was terrifying. My parents went to my grandma's bingo game, so it was just me and my two brothers, Hayden, my little brother, and Wyatt, who's the same age as me, home alone. We wanted to pull an all-nighter, like most teens do with their Monster energy drinks, but even with 2 cans each, we got tired. It was around 2:30 a.m. when Hayden got into his pajamas, brushed his teeth, and was ready for bed. I tucked him in at 2:53. Afterward, Wyatt and I decided to watch The Lion King, a movie we hadn't seen in a long time. We finished watching it, turned off the TV and the lamp, and decided to camp out in the living room. Just as we were about to go to bed, the clock struck 3:00 a.m. I jokingly told Wyatt, we almost made it to an all-nighter. Then suddenly, someone knocked on the door. A few minutes later, there was another knock, but this time on the window. I thought to myself, oh great, that monster is really messing with me. I put on my earphones, trying to ignore it. But then someone whistled outside. I pulled out my earphones and said, Wyatt, stop, you're scaring me. He woke up and replied, what? I'm not doing anything. That's when we heard a loud bang on the door, like something or someone was desperately trying to come in. Wyatt, being the curious one, got up and walked toward the door. He was just a step away from opening it when I grabbed his shirt and said, are you insane? We can't open the door. He paused and said, well, I'm going to look out the window. He did, but he didn't see anyone. We have a security light by the door and 2 blue heelers, dogs that always bark when they hear something. After that loud bang, the dogs started barking like crazy. Wyatt and I were getting really scared. The thing outside kept whistling, and something kept banging on the door. Wyatt grabbed my iPod and started recording the sounds. Meanwhile, Hayden, who had woken up by now, went to look out the window. He saw something, like a tall, skinny shadow just standing there, staring at him for about a minute or two. Then suddenly, it ran away. It terrified him. He quickly shut the curtains and ran over to me. We were all in shock, but when the clock struck 4:00 a.m., all the noises suddenly stopped. It was eerie, but we felt a sense of relief. We turned on every light in the house, even the bathroom lights. About half an hour later, our parents came home. They saw us still awake and asked, oh, you guys are still up? We looked at each other and said, we're not going to sleep. When they asked why, we told them the whole story and played the recording for them. My dad listened and said, skinwalkers. Those were definitely skinwalkers. The whistles you heard, they make those sounds using animal bones, hearing that made it all even creepier. In the morning, we showed our parents and a medicine man where the skinwalkers had been knocking on the door and window. They found bones and footprints outside. The medicine man told us Hayden was lucky he didn't get witchcrafted. When skinwalkers use witchcraft, they wish bad things upon you. I'm so glad Wyatt didn't open the door. It was another typical night working the graveyard shift, and I had gotten used to the little noises and weird taps that happened throughout the night. But one particular night really got to me, and I started wondering if working these late shifts was giving me anxiety. I was struggling to stay awake, so I kept drinking coffee, water, and energy drinks. As you can imagine, I was constantly running to the bathroom. While washing my hands, I had this sudden feeling, a sense that something was about to happen. It seemed silly at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I hurried back to my desk. My phone rang just as my coworker headed out to the break room and restroom for his break. About 10 minutes later, I saw him leave the restroom area, chatting on his phone, and heading out to the balcony. I was back at my desk, but of course, I needed the bathroom again. I waited until he was done with his break, and then headed to the restroom. I always dreaded that area at night. As I turned the corner, I noticed something felt off. The carpet felt softer under my flip-flops, almost like it was wet. The hallway seemed darker too. I approached the bathroom door and heard a rushing sound, almost like a fan on high speed, except we didn't have any fans in the bathroom. I peeked inside and saw that the floor was flooded. What the hell? I muttered to myself, shocked. Between the men's and women's restrooms, there's a small room with lockers and a shower, left over from when the building used to have a gym. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, but I knew I had to check it out. The sound was coming from the shower area. I opened the door, turned on the light, and saw that the shower head was turned outward, blasting hot water all over the floor. The curtain was pulled back, and the water was just pouring out. I couldn't believe it. I ran back to the office and yelled for my coworker. "Come here." He jogged over, looking concerned. What's wrong?" I pointed to the floor and led him into the women's restroom. His mouth dropped open, and he started laughing. "Did you take a shower or something?" he joked. "No," I told him, insisting I'd been in there just a little while ago, and everything was fine. There was no water, no noise, nothing. We checked the men's restroom and saw the water had flooded that side too. "We need to call the boss," my coworker said, "or they'll think we were goofing off." I kept repeating, "But I was just in here. What the hell happened?" We went back to the shower. The water was still blasting, and the lever to turn it off was one of those long, firm ones that you really have to push hard to turn. Whoever, or whatever, turned it on had to have pushed it down forcefully. I asked my coworker, "You're not messing with me, right? You didn't turn this on to scare me." He kept insisting he hadn't. We searched the entire building, checked the parking lot, and made sure no one else was around. The janitor's closet, which was usually open, was locked tight that night. We found some wet floor signs and used old towels to soak up the water as best as we could. Then we went back to our desks, puzzled. During my last break, I walked around the building in the dark, talking out loud. "Hello, did you turn on the shower?" That was pretty impressive, I joked, trying to lighten the mood. I didn't hear anything back, but for some reason, I felt a weird sense of amusement. I'd always felt like there was a female presence in the building, a shadow figure around 5'5". It felt like she was just bored and playing around, though that might sound strange. By 4 a.m., some of the morning shift workers were starting to arrive. We didn't say a word to anyone, and quietly went back to our desks as calls started coming in. At 6 a.m., when my shift ended, the janitor came in. He noticed the wet floor and looked confused, walking around and inspecting the area. I wanted to tell him what happened, but I knew he wasn't the type to believe in paranormal stuff. Later, I heard he called a plumber to check for leaks in the pipes, but we knew it wasn't a plumbing issue. We only told a couple of our fellow night shift coworkers about what really happened. It was definitely the most interesting night at work, that's for sure. My grandmother's house stands in Baldwin Park, K. She has lived there for over 50 years, raising my father and my 3 uncles in that house. I spent many weekends there growing up and still visit her a few times a year. As I got older, I started seeing things, unexplainable things. Her house has a long hallway, and I would often see dark figures standing there, staring at me. The sight of them terrified me, and I'd run to tell my grandmother. She'd always laugh it off, saying I was just seeing things, or that those scary movies I watched were messing with my mind. One night, my grandmother and I were watching TV in the living room. She got up to use the restroom, leaving me alone. Immediately, I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me. I was too afraid to even glance down the hallway. I'm terrified of that hallway. I tried to focus on the TV, but the feeling grew stronger. Then, out of nowhere, I heard deep breathing right in my ear. It was so clear, I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I jumped up, but there was nothing there. I remember screaming for my grandmother. She rushed to me, and I cried in her arms, overwhelmed with fear. After calming down, I explained what had happened, but she shrugged it off again, telling me to stop watching horror movies. I was only 9 at the time. After that, I refused to spend the night at my grandmother's house. I would visit during the day, but once night fell, I'd ask my dad to pick me up. He'd ask why I didn't want to stay, but I never told him. I didn't think he'd believe me. My grandmother already thought I was just imagining things, and I didn't want my dad to think the same. When I was 15, one of my uncles passed away unexpectedly. It was devastating for my grandmother, and she didn't want to be alone, so she asked me to stay the weekend with her. I wanted to, but I was still scared of her house. My father asked again why I didn't want to stay, and this time, I finally told him what I had seen and experienced in her house. I expected him to think I was crazy, but instead, he sat quietly for a moment, then began telling me stories of his own. He explained that he and his brothers had seen the same dark figure many times while growing up in the house. He told me about a night when he was lying in bed and saw his bedroom door open. A dark figure stood in the doorway, just staring at him. He yelled for his brother to wake up, and when one of my uncles jumped up and yelled at the figure to go away, it vanished. My dad said this happened often. I told him I had tried to tell my grandmother, but she didn't believe me. My dad said that she was stubborn and didn't want to believe her house was haunted, even though she had experienced the same thing. He shared a story from when he was a teenager. He and his brothers were in the living room when they suddenly heard a loud scream coming from their mother's room. All 4 of them ran to see what was wrong. There in the hallway was the same huge black figure standing in the doorway to my grandmother's room. As soon as it saw them, it ran to the end of the hallway, where there was a back door leading to the yard. My dad and uncles chased after it, but the figure disappeared out the back door. My father said he didn't think it was an evil spirit, as it never harmed anyone. He believed it was just a lost soul wandering around the house. That night, I stayed over, and nothing happened. Slowly, I started staying the night more often. I still felt like I was being watched every time I was there, but I tried to ignore it. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of the dark figure out of the corner of my eye, but I forced myself to pretend I didn't see it. I reminded myself that it was just a lost soul, and it wouldn't hurt me. And it never did. I'm 26 now, and try to visit my grandmother as often as I can. I live in Arizona now, so I don't get to see her as much as I'd like. But when I do, I don't stay the night. I have 2 kids, and I don't want them to go through what I did. I was staying at my dad's house, the creepy one where I grew up, with the portal in the back bedroom. It was October 29th, and I was sleeping in the spare room. That night, I had a strange dream about a Native American man standing by the door near the light switches, repeatedly telling me to leave. Suddenly, I started getting flashes of a little African American girl, about 10 years old. She was wearing a pink and white striped shirt, jean shorts, and had pink hair ties in her pigtails. I kept hearing the word immerse over and over, and then I had a vivid image of her forearm up close to my face, showing a large infected lesion. I was focused on the girl for a moment, but then my attention shifted back to the native man, who was now dressed in a loincloth. In the dream, I leaped out of bed and ran toward the door, desperate to escape. But just as I opened the door, I realized I shouldn't run. I slammed the door shut and began attacking the wall where the man had been standing. I was punching and kicking the wall, but only making contact with the flat surface. He wasn't there. Suddenly, I was pushed backward, and as I flew, the wall grabbed onto my robe. It was as if my robe was stuck to the wall, pulling me back. I couldn't see him, just the flat surface holding on. I stood up and tugged at my robe, trying to free myself, only to have different sections like my sleeve get stuck again. If anyone had seen me, they'd probably think I looked like a lunatic. Then I woke up. I could still sense the native man standing by the door, but the girl was gone. I spoke to him, saying, "I understand that this might have been your room, and you're not used to sharing. But I've had a really stressful couple of days, and I'd appreciate it if you'd leave me alone and let me rest. I won't bother you if you don't bother me." He didn't move, and his anger only seemed to grow, creating a static-like tension between us. At that point, I got angry too. Do not try to intimidate me. I am an invited guest here, and this was my house long before you came. I grew up here. I command you to leave my room. I call upon the white light to exorcise you from this house, never to return. I visualized white light surrounding me, the ceiling, the floor, and all four walls, including the closet. He fought back, pushing against the light with incredible strength and stubbornness. But eventually, he left. The moment he did, I heard a loud crash. The cat food was thrown against the side door, and my dad's cell phone started going off randomly. It scared the living daylights out of me. Even after he left, I still felt like I was being watched, which is a common feeling in my dad's house. So I called on my demon friend to watch over me for the rest of the night. After that, I fell asleep without any further incidents, but I really hate sleeping there. As for the little girl, I'm not sure why she appeared. I suspect she was just passing through the portal and didn't mean any harm. She seemed like she was missing her mom, and since I was the only female in the house, I guess I was the closest thing to comfort for her. I'm 25 years old now, but this story takes me back to when I was 15. Back then, I had a lot going on, including my father being taken to jail by the DEA. I never fully understood the reasons, but I do know most of it was based on lies. He had suffered from so many concussions that his memory wasn't clear, and that made everything more complicated. This all happened about 2 months after he was taken away. My family has always been familiar with the paranormal. On my mom's side, there's a long history of psychic abilities. My great-great-grandmother read tea leaves. My great-grandmother could sense things about people before even meeting them. My grandfather can read auras. And my mom hears dead people, though she stopped seeing them after a particularly intense encounter with a friend's deceased sibling. As for me, I can hear them too, but I only see them when I'm asleep or in moments of need, either for myself or someone close to me. After my dad went to prison, my mom had a hard time coping, so my younger sister, brother, and I took turns sleeping in her room. My parents had been together for as long as I could remember, and the separation hit her hard. My sister and I usually shared a room, but she moved to the couch. At first, I thought it was just because she missed Dad, but soon, I learned there was more to it. I never felt comfortable in that house anymore. And eventually, I understood why. Our house was located between 2 graveyards, which, as you can imagine, already gave it a spooky atmosphere. The upper graveyard was so old that many of the headstones no longer had legible writing. Some dated back to 1779. The lower graveyard was newer, with headstones from 1909 and onward. On certain nights, thick fog would roll in, but instead of spreading out, it would settle only in our yard. We would see figures outside our windows and politely wave, acknowledging their presence and showing respect. We always made sure to let them know it was our home now. After my dad left, things took a strange turn. I began hearing growls in my room. My sister, who had moved to sleep elsewhere, refused to come into the room unless it was daytime. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was too old to be scared of the dark. But as the days went by, the unsettling feelings only intensified. I started sleeping with my dog in my room for comfort, but that's when things got worse. Every night, I'd lie in bed, staring at my closet, and I'd see red eyes glaring back at me. A primal growl, so deep it shook me to my core, would fill the room. My dog would either growl in fear or hide under the covers with me. This went on for months. I became depressed, eventually resorting to self-harm. My mom discovered this 2 years later and banned anything sharp from my room. But even without sharp objects, the growling escalated. It began speaking, low growls turning into screams telling me to get out. One night, it went too far. I watched in horror as my necklace, a big chain ball necklace, floated out of the closet and began striking my dog. Terrified and desperate, I screamed for it to stop, shouting, "You will not hurt my dog. This is my room. Leave." But instead of scaring it away, I only made it angrier. The next morning, I woke up to find a steak knife stabbed into my headboard, with another in my dresser drawer. Horrified, I called for my mom. After a long lecture about not having sharp objects in my room, I swore to her I hadn't put them there. She could tell I was telling the truth. I finally told her everything. And she was furious that I hadn't come to her sooner. My mom smudged the room with sage, and for a month, things seemed to calm down. But before long, the disturbances returned. This time, I didn't wait. I ran straight to my mom, and she called my aunt to come and bless the room. After that, the entity was finally gone. Even though the room was cleared, I couldn't bring myself to sleep there anymore, so I moved across the hall. Despite everything, I'm grateful for the experience. It shaped me and made me feel connected to my family's history with the paranormal. I know I'm not alone in these encounters, and I'm happy to share my story with others who understand. One night, I was just relaxing and watching television. It was late, and I had the lights off so that I could easily fall asleep when I started to get tired. Around 1 a.m., my brother and I started a small conversation when I noticed something strange. There, between 2 pizza boxes stacked on top of each other, I saw a small, very bright orange light. It was no bigger than a pinball, just sitting still in the space between me and my brother. I could see it clearly, but he couldn't. At first, I thought it might have been the recharge light from his PSP reflecting between the boxes, but as I glanced away and looked back, the light disappeared. Later, I realized that the angle his PSP was sitting at wouldn't have allowed the light to shine through the boxes, especially since it wasn't plugged in. The strangest part was that even though the light was incredibly bright, it didn't illuminate anything around it. About 20 minutes later, my brother saw the same pinpoint of orange light, this time on the wall behind me. We both found it odd that we were seeing the exact same thing. Later that evening, we saw it again, this time falling from the ceiling and dropping into the floor incredibly fast. A month after this happened, we saw the orange light once more, but this time, it was accompanied by a sickening dark presence, a feeling of evil, for lack of a better word. This made me especially nervous because, a few months earlier, I had discovered a Ouija board in the hall closet outside my room. It belonged to one of my roommates. I immediately asked him to remove it because just the sight of it made me uncomfortable. A few days after the board was removed, strange things started happening. I heard doors slamming around the apartment, and one afternoon, I saw a dark, shadowy figure standing outside my window, looking in at me in broad daylight. That image was burned into my mind. I didn't feel that dark presence again until the second time the orange light appeared. During the second encounter with the light, I had a friend over, someone who knew nothing about my previous experience with the shadow figure. He felt the presence too, describing the same feeling I had during that first encounter. The air in the room became stagnant and hot, even with the air conditioning running. There was no airflow, no escape from the oppressive feeling. I grew up in a small town west of Phoenix. It was a farming community with no more than 1,500 people in total. My father volunteered as an officer with the local police force, and he would go out on patrol once or twice a week. Often, my mother would take me and spend the night at my grandmother's house so she wouldn't be alone. My grandmother's house was very small, around 600 square feet, but it had a large yard, which will come into play shortly. The yard was completely fenced off from the street by a waist-high picket fence. To reach the front door, you entered the gate next to the driveway and walked about 30 feet up to the porch. This walkway was in plain view from the front door. One night, my father was out on patrol. My mother and I were staying at my grandparents' house, sleeping in the front room. Around 2 or 3 a.m., there was a knock at the front door. My grandmother had been up with me, and my mother was asleep on the couch. The knock woke my mother. Both she and my grandmother assumed it was my father, even though he wasn't expected back for a few more hours. Keep in mind, this was a small town where crime wasn't much of an issue. So when they heard the knock, my grandmother went straight to the door, while my mother started gathering our things to head home. But when my grandmother opened the door, it wasn't my father. Standing there was a woman with light hair, green eyes. My grandmother always remembered her eyes vividly, and a fur coat the same color as her hair. My mother, who was behind my grandmother, saw the woman too and confirmed these details. My grandmother asked, "Can I help you?" The woman responded, "Can I come sit by your fire?" Something about the woman unnerved my grandmother, who wasn't easily scared. Without thinking, she replied, "Hell no," and slammed the door in the woman's face. My grandmother said she never understood why she reacted so strongly. Immediately, she opened the door again to apologize, and my mother rushed to the window next to the door to get another look. But the woman was gone. It couldn't have been more than a second or two between slamming the door and opening it again, yet the woman had vanished. They both went out into the yard and looked up and down the street, but there was no sign of her. They stayed awake for the next few hours until my father arrived, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, they asked the neighbors if anyone else had heard a knock on their door, but no one had. Another strange detail was the neighborhood itself. My grandmother lived in a quiet area off the main road, and she had been there for over 30 years. She knew everyone on the street and in the town, but neither she nor my mother recognized this woman. The highway, Bucky Road, was more than a mile away, and there were several neighborhoods and gas stations between it and my grandmother's house. It seemed unlikely that a lost traveler would end up at her doorstep. Even more puzzling, how did the woman disappear so quickly without a trace? I don't know who or what that woman was. I don't know what she wanted, aside from sitting by a non-existent fire. My grandmother didn't even have a fireplace. But I do know that this actually happened. When I was in my 3rd year of college, I befriended a guy named Mike who was an archaeology major. Over Christmas break, Mike and I came down to the valley from Flagstaff to work on a construction project with my father. One day, it was raining pretty hard, so we couldn't work. Mike suggested we head to one of the Indian reservations near Phoenix to look for pottery shards and other artifacts. I didn't know better at the time, so I agreed. I had never done that before, and I was interested in checking it out. We drove east on I-10 past the Gila River Bridge and turned west onto a road that took us past the Gila Indian Cultural Center. We went a mile or so further, and Mike told me to pull over. We got out and started looking. I didn't know what I was supposed to be looking for, so Mike bent down, picked up a small broken piece of pottery right by my feet and said, "This." He then showed me how to spot artifacts. I remember him specifically teaching me how to dig through the tailings of animal burrows, because sometimes animals dug up ancient items. Following his advice, we found numerous pottery shards, broken shell bracelets, beads, and other items. We gathered so many artifacts that our pockets were overflowing. We decided to take what we had found back to my truck and then come back to search some more. As I was filling my pockets and turning to head back to the truck, something caught my eye. About 10 to 15 yards away, in a small clearing, I saw a large pot and a small flat basket sitting on a grass mat. Excited, Mike and I quickly hurried back to my truck, dropped off the artifacts, and rushed back to the spot where we had seen the pot. But when we arrived, it was gone. The clearing was still there, but the pot and basket had vanished. Mike and I looked around, walked back and forth through the area, and finally I asked, "You saw that, right?" He nodded. "Where did it go?" I asked. Mike stood there for a moment, scanning the area, and then turned to me and said, "They're messing with us." I was confused. "Who?" I asked. "The Indians," Mike replied. I looked around. "Mike, there's no one here. Where did it go?" He shook his head. "Not someone. The Indian spirits." I thought that sounded ridiculous and told him so, but Mike just shrugged and said, "It doesn't matter what you think. You saw the pot, I saw the pot, and now it's gone. The spirits wanted us to see it, and then they took it away to spook us. It happens all the time out here." He went on to explain that this kind of thing was common during digs in the desert. Objects would move, disappear, and sometimes you'd hear voices. He said archaeologists don't usually talk about it, but it happens surprisingly often. At that point, I was creeped out. I couldn't make sense of what had happened. We wandered around a few more minutes in the rain, and then we drove home. We never really talked about it again because there was no way to explain it. I've grown up around things of spiritual and paranormal nature. My father, earlier in his life, was deeply into metaphysical healing, tarot readings, and other similar practices. Maybe this exposure has made me more open to these types of experiences. I'm not entirely sure. I've often wondered if my brief encounter with a Ouija board could have opened a door to the strange occurrences that happen to me now. But again, I don't know. Perhaps someone with more insight could help shed light on my situation. For the past few years, I've had several encounters with paranormal figures, though I'm usually reluctant to talk about them out of fear of being misunderstood. However, there's one particular figure that has returned time and again, often in unexpected moments. It's a black figure, and by its essence, it feels male to me. This figure has been showing up in the darkness for quite some time. At first, it would simply stand there, and I'd take notice of its presence. There was one occasion when I had bunk beds, and a friend sleeping on the top bunk told me the next morning that she had noticed a man standing and watching her during the night. I only ever saw the outline, never the details of the figure, but the fact that she sensed its male presence left me unsettled. There have been a few instances where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and immediately feel something approaching. The sensation would start with my legs and I'd feel pressure, as if something were holding them down. Sometimes it would wrap its hands around my ankles, while other times it would pick up my legs and move them. In those early encounters, I was always unable to move or speak. The two most recent encounters with this same figure have happened within the past year. In one instance, I was lying in bed, about to fall asleep, when I felt the figure's presence behind me. I could feel pressure on my cheek, almost like a hand pressing down. Normally, I'd feel terrified or nervous when it was around, but this encounter was surprisingly calm. The most recent encounter took place in November at a friend's house. This was the first time something like this has followed me out of my bedroom, at least to my knowledge. My friend and I had both fallen asleep on her living room couches. Before drifting off, I sensed the figure standing in the shadows of the lower-level bar area, just watching me. For context, her house has an open layout, with the living room, kitchen, and bar area connected by two small steps. I woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling of something lying on my legs, trying to reach up and grab my arms, as if it wanted to fully pin me down. Unlike previous encounters where I couldn't move or speak, this time I was able to struggle and call out my friend's name. And then it went away. The next morning, I told my friend what had happened. She said she had sensed something in the house too and remembered hearing my voice, but she had been too deep in sleep to fully respond. Aside from talking to my father about these experiences, I've only ever told that friend about the figure. I've never been entirely sure what it is. Is it just toying with me, and my fear is an overreaction? Or could it be something much darker? About 3 years ago, my best friend Monique called me one night in October, and asked me to come over to her grandparents' house, where she used to live. It was just a couple of blocks away from my place, so I walked there at night. When I arrived, we started drinking a few beers. Then, Monique's older sister came out and sat with us on the porch. They started talking about a seance they had done with their cousin at his trailer, and how freaked out they had been that night. After discussing it for a while, Monique's sister pulled out her phone and told me about some recordings they had captured. On the phone, there were 4 or 5 recordings from that night, right after the seance. Monique had just gotten home when her cousin Jessie called, freaking out, crying, and saying, "Monique, help me. He's not leaving me alone. He's right next to me. I can't see him, but I can feel him beside me." At the same time, Monique was hearing a demonic voice, a deep, growling voice. But only she could hear it, not her cousin. One of the most disturbing recordings was Monique saying, "Leave him alone. Get away from him," and a deep, growling voice answering back with a drawn-out "no." It was terrifying, especially since you could still hear her cousin panicking in the background. When I heard it, I almost lost it. No one believes us when we talk about it. They think the recording was made up, but it wasn't. It's real. A few days later, I went back to her grandma's house. Monique invited me over to watch a new TV show called Paranormal Lab, but the whole time, we both felt this strange uneasiness that we couldn't explain. We ended up going to her bedroom, closing the door, and watching the show there. Then Monique got a call from one of her friends and stepped outside to meet them. I was alone and feeling really uneasy, so I moved to the living room. Out of nowhere, she started yelling, "Hey, that's not funny. Open the door. Why did you lock it?" Confused, I replied, "What are you talking about? I haven't even touched the door." When I went to open it, the latch was fully turned, locking the door from the inside. I was the only one inside at the time. We heard strange noises on the roof after that, and both of us freaked out, so we went outside to wait for her friend to arrive. About a week later, Paranormal Activity came out in theaters, and Monique and I went to see it. Afterward, we went to her cousin's trailer, and Monique decided it would be a great time to do another seance. I wanted no part of it, but Monique and her cousin went ahead anyway. We sat around the kitchen table, Monique, her 2 cousins, and me, while her sister was with her kids in the living room. Monique and her cousin began the seance by lighting a candle, turning off the lights, and starting the ritual. I was praying the entire time. As they spoke, the candle would dim and then light up again, growing brighter and dimmer. I was freaking out. When they finished and turned the lights on, all hell broke loose. Both Monique and her cousin started crying uncontrollably. They jumped out of their chairs, running back and forth, shouting, "Get away from me. Leave us alone." Her cousin insisted they needed to read the same lines they had recited earlier to close the seance and send the spirit away, but Monique refused. She was hysterical. Her cousin managed to read the lines by himself and calm down, but Monique was still crying uncontrollably. Her sister got up to try and calm her down, and I grabbed a bottle of holy water they had, throwing it around her and at her. After a while, she finally calmed down. I went home that night, praying and shaken from what I had just witnessed. A few days later, Monique told me she was still seeing things, but thank God, she's doing much better now. Friday morning, I got a call from my mom at 7 a.m. Now, my mom knows the time difference between us and never calls this early unless it's an emergency. My heart sank as I answered the phone. She was crying and told me that my uncle had to be rushed to the ER due to severe stomach pain. At first, I was confused, thinking, okay, why the urgency? Then she explained that he had just come back from an MRI, and the doctors discovered that his colon had ruptured. It took me a moment to process. I was half asleep. I had only been asleep for a few hours after all. When it finally sank in, I asked her to clarify. She said, his abdomen is flooded with pus and abscesses, and the doctors don't think he'll make it. That hit hard because my uncle is my favorite. But oddly enough, I felt completely calm. Normally, I'm the one in the family who breaks down in situations like this. I panic, cry, and feel like the world is crumbling. But this time, I felt something else, almost like a comforting hug followed by a gentle smack to the back of my head. And in that moment, I realized why my grandma had been yelling at me. Instead of feeling guilty, I just got this sense of, it's okay, next time you'll understand. As all of this was happening, I allowed myself to connect more with her, appreciating the moments we shared. I haven't seen her since I was 4, but I could feel her presence now, more than ever. Thankfully, by some grace, my uncle made it through. He just finished his second surgery, and the doctors now believe they can save part, if not half of his colon. This was such a relief for the whole family. But last night, I had an interesting experience. I spent most of the night sitting at the side of my uncle's bed with my grandma. He's in Maine, 3,000 miles away. But there we were, talking over him, watching him as he slept. I later found out he didn't sleep well because he kept hearing voices, probably us. Oops, sorry about that. But our family has never been happier to see someone make it through something this serious. Now I've told my grandma that while I'm open to talking, it needs to be through thoughts for now. And since then, we've been communicating, and I feel more at peace, calmer than I've felt in a long time. Back in 2007, I moved into a house in Gilbert, AZ. After living there for a while, I felt the urge to visit the cemetery and put flowers on my aunt's grave. That's when everything changed. Something followed me home from the cemetery. I've dealt with the paranormal my entire life, and I've always had a sense for when spirits were nearby. At the time, I was living with my girlfriend, Whitney, and my best friend, David, who occupied the second bedroom. The day I visited the cemetery was the day the activity in my house began. It started small. Footsteps could be heard downstairs, seemingly coming from David's room. We both heard them at the same time and had the same thought. Something strange was happening. Over time, Whitney began noticing odd noises and uneasy feelings in the house too. One morning, she called me at 5:30 a.m., scared because she heard someone walking outside the bedroom door. It spooked her so much that she went to her parents' house, but didn't want to wake David over something like that. A week later, I woke up around 7 a.m. on a weekend. This time, I didn't hear the footsteps outside the room. They were in the room. I could hear the soft sound of carpet compressing under each step, and I followed the movement with my eyes as it left the room. I wasn't afraid, so I kept quiet about it to avoid freaking Whitney out, but I couldn't wait to tell David. Months passed, and David moved out, with my brother, his wife, and my nephew moving into the house. They too experienced the strange activity. But by this time, it had escalated beyond just footsteps. We started hearing loud bangs upstairs, and one night, my sister-in-law and I decided to test it. I had a solid rubber ball, which I placed on the second step of the staircase. It was about 7 inches from the edge. I told the entity, "If you're here, move the ball." Then we went outside for a smoke, and after a while, we forgot about the whole experiment. But when we came back into the house, we heard a loud thud. I rushed upstairs and saw the ball had rolled off the step and was sitting 2 feet away on the landing. This ball was heavy, and there's no way it could have moved on its own. That was the moment I knew something more than coincidence was happening. We started recording EVPs, and to my surprise, we captured something chilling. My little brother set up the recorder in an empty room while we were out. After 2 hours of recording, we listened back and heard terrifying sounds. 30 minutes into the recording, there was a loud breath, like a man exhaling directly into the microphone. It sent chills down our spines. Other sounds included loud bangs from inside the room. My brother and his family were so scared they eventually moved out. Things worsened after they left. One night, while I was alone, I was sitting at my computer when a loud bang shook the entire house. The chandelier above me was swinging from the impact. It sounded like someone had dropped a bowling ball directly above my head. I froze, trying to listen for more sounds, and then I heard the doorknob upstairs rattling. That was enough for me. I grabbed my keys and went to the casino to wait for the sun to come up. It was the only place I could think of where I wouldn't be alone. It became clear that the activity intensified when I was alone. Strange things kept happening. One time, while going upstairs, all the smoke detectors in the house went off. The moment I came back down, they stopped. I even told the spirits that it was my house and I was in control, but that didn't seem to work. As I prepared to move out of the house to relocate to Colorado, something even more bizarre happened. I had just returned home and placed my sunglasses on my laptop. As I was coaxing my cat to come upstairs with me, I watched as my sunglasses flew off the laptop and hit the wall 5 feet away. They didn't just fall, they launched. Despite my fear, I went upstairs to check things out. The air upstairs felt heavy, colder than usual, and incredibly still. I quickly glanced around, but I felt so drained that I decided to lie down. I must have passed out because when I woke up, it was dark. No lights were on. I heard a loud pop from the floor and saw my cat staring behind me, wide-eyed and ready to run. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a slightly glowing whitish figure in the mirror, about 6 feet tall, watching me. It disappeared quickly, and then I felt a sharp, electrifying surge of energy shoot through me, causing my body to arch and tense up. When I finally woke up the next afternoon, I was downstairs, with no memory of how I got there. But I remembered everything that had happened before I passed out. Since that day, I've had what I believe is a gift. I get thoughts of the future, not visions, but clear thoughts. It's like reading a book rather than watching a movie. Some of the thoughts are random, but others feel significant. The hard part is distinguishing between precognition and random thoughts. When my mind goes into this precognitive mode, I feel a dull sensation in my head. I've tested myself using Zinner cards online and can get 9 out of 10 correct when I'm in that mode. When I'm not, I can't get them right at all. One time, I had a thought about my son getting stung by a scorpion. An hour later, it happened. That's when I realized I needed to understand this gift. I've tested it in various ways, like guessing the cars behind me at a drive-thru, and I've been eerily accurate. I keep a book of these thoughts and write them down when they happen, trying to make sense of this gift I received from that house.